Cypherpunk Bitstream is on the air again. Frank Braun and me, Smugger, having a conversation today about Cryptoanarchy. But before we start, I have to admit that this whole podcasting thing is really uncomfortable for me.
Yeah, for me too.
Recording yourself for what? I mean, why do I do this? Why do I record myself and then it will be used in a trial against me?
Yeah, I thought you're like some sort of privacy extremist.
Yeah, I thought so too. But apparently, the mission won. The mission won.
The mission won, yeah.
Fuck that. Yeah, if you haven't realized that by now, this recording is not really safe for work, and you shouldn't have your children listen to it because there's cursing, and we don't actually censor ourselves that much. So if your child is younger than 4 years, you shouldn't have the child listen to it. If it's older than 4 years, it'll probably be able to curse better than we are. So, so what is that? RPG 4 or something like that, right? So, yeah, today we want to talk about Cryptoanarchy.
Yeah, and we do that while sitting at Task Zero in Berlin in our container, hoping that no zombies will invade the conversation.
True that. And if they do, we're gonna smack them. Never mind. There's the fire drum burning outside, burning all our evidence. In this case, empty boxes of cigarettes. So,
yeah, since you, I think you introduced me to the concept of Cryptoanarchy about 10 years ago when we first met.
So you're blaming me now?
Kind of.
Okay. Traitor.
You at least played a major role in that. So, yeah, why don't you start then telling our listeners what is Cryptoanarchy?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a big bite to take.
Okay.
Maybe start with...
What is crypto or what is anarchy?
Yeah, exactly. Let's pick it apart. So I'll do the anarchy part. I actually think that anarchy is one of those fluid concepts. A lot of people have very different ideas what anarchy really means. So my grandma would probably say, I mean, rest in peace, but she would probably say that anarchy is when everybody kills each other and there's violence in the streets and blood running.
Nobody wants that, right?
Nobody wants that, right? Well, some people do want that, but they're usually not the anarchists, but the statists. Anarchy is the absence of coercive rule for me. So it's not the absence of rules, and it's not the absence of hierarchies or whatever, but it's the absence of hierarchies and rules that you didn't agree to. So anarchy is really about having a system of consent where every participant has agreed on how things should be going and is at any time more or less able to leave and change his affiliations and choose a different system if he wants to. So it's not about the absence of rules and chaos and all the fun stuff, but it's about the absence of people forcing you to agree with them. You know, that I mean, it's a really shit thing, you know. In the normal world, in the state, you have a couple of hundred people that basically run the organization.
Top-down style, usually.
Top-down style, usually. From time to time, there's a little bit of window dressing, you know. Oh, yeah, you can vote for who gonna oppress you, you know. It's always awesome, you know. Sheep can select the butcher. So that is how it works out there. And you are expected to go along with that, even if you cannot disagree, really. Well, you can disagree, but you shouldn't act on your disagreement. And if you break the rules that other people made for you and have told you that you have to stick to them, they will fine you, take your property, or put you into jail, or worse. So, and that is the fundamental thing that's simply not right. And it's not, the problem is not so much that, you know, real violent criminals shouldn't be punished. That's not the issue. The issue is that people tell you what to do without you being able to opt out, disconnect from them, do your own thing. And basically those people that tell you what the rules are, they make this basic assumption that they are more moral, wiser, enlightened, whatever, than you are. And anybody who has listened to any politician on this planet speak so far should know that politicians are, in general, as dumb as fuck as everybody else. And just because we have this system of legitimacy, however that looks like, if it's hereditary, like in a monarchy, or like a democracy where you have this game of voting, only that is used, so to speak, to justify that some people are better than you. And I find that deeply troubling. I find this concept of people declaring themselves inherently more important than you and more relevant than you. I find that problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that gives me a good idea of the concept of anarchy. What does crypto mean for you in that context?
Well, the word cryptoanarchy, I think, was coined on the Cypherpunk mailing list in the 90s. And it's actually a little bit of a play of words, because it uses the meaning of crypto as something that is hidden. So crypto basically is Greek, I think, and it means hidden. And cryptoanarchy is basically the hidden anarchy. That is one of the meanings. Mm-hmm. And the other meaning could be using cryptography for implementing anarchy. So using cryptography to create a new system, quote unquote, that allows us to create our own rules, etc., and have uncoercive membership, so non-coercive membership. So in a crypto-anarchist system, we can use cryptography to declare ourselves members and also disappear again. Mm-hmm. So I think that is where it initially comes from. There have been multiple people thinking about it in more detail. And we can come to that later, but that is what it was in the beginning. So, and I think the important part there is really the absence of coercive rules. Mm-hmm. That we can have if you're either hidden, so we can not obey the rules, but nobody knows that. So that's option number one. Or option number two is we have systems that allow us to be relatively offensive but be individually hidden. So there's this difference between, hiding a whole system of anarchy or hiding the participants in that. Mm. And I think for me, the latter is the more important one, being able to hide the individuals in a system, but not necessarily hide the system.
Mm. It sounds to be like the simpler thing as well.
It's the more relevant thing, I think. Mm-hmm. Because if you have an issue with coercive rule, then, at least for me, that's not just an individual thing. So if I'm able to hide from the oppressors. That's nice, but in the end, you kind of have this urge to help your fellow man hide himself as well.
Mm-hmm. Give him the means.
Exactly, give him the means, tell him about how to do it, etc. And as soon as you start help other people to be hidden as well, then it's not actually about hiding the system anymore. You know, you spread the system while you hide the individual.
True.
So the hidden individual anarchistic behavior is it's nice, but it's relatively meaningless. It becomes fully meaningful if individuals can create new communities, new societies, etc. that might be very public, but that do not allow any single person to be affiliated with it, or at least not openly, or that allow people that participate in it just hide what exactly they're doing there.
Mm-hmm.
And the latter is actually the more interesting thing, because it's it might have an effect. You know, it reaches beyond just individuals. It's more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it's also what is more interesting. You know, like the challenges you have to deal with and to overcome when you're participating in a system of cryptoanarchy are completely different ones. Mm. You know, I mean, the individual cryptoanarchist that is just hiding himself, that is something we all know. You know, it's you go to the bathroom, you lock the door, and whatever you do in the bathroom is cryptoanarchy. You know,
hopefully it is.
Yeah, hopefully it is, unless you're a cam girl. You know, but so that part of cryptoanarchy, everybody of us, or most of us, is very familiar with. You know, we have those hidden moments where we break the rules. You know, I really don't want to know what you're doing on the bathroom. You know, I really don't. And I'm pretty sure you don't want to tell me. And I'm very happy for that. You know, I'm thankful for that. And everybody else does the same thing. You know, even politicians are crypto-anarchists when it comes to the bathroom. I hope. You know, I really don't want our chancellor or president live streaming on the internet what they're doing on the bathroom.
Yeah, so it's one of the last taboos in a modern society.
And rightfully so. If you look at those people, you really don't want them to on Pornhub, you know. So that part of cryptoanarchy everybody gets, and it's the non-important part. The important part is creating systems of cryptoanarchy. So basically, let's create big bathrooms.
So if we combine the two, would you agree that cryptoanarchy as a term means creating systems of anarchy, as in no rulership, by the means of cryptography?
Yeah, yes. And I think that is really special about the idea of cryptoanarchy. So there are a lot of ideas or systems or whatever that want to create anarchy. But cryptoanarchy has a very different approach to creating that.
In what sense?
I think the easiest way to look at it is to see how any form of rulership actually has to operate, because all of us more or less operate like that. And that is, when you want to interact with the world, you have to observe the world, you have to basically decide what's going on, and you have to act on that. And there's this nice little term, it's called OODA. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act.
The OODA loop.
The OODA loop, which is a concept from the military. Actually, it was used for describing interaction in air war.
Yeah.
And the only thing that it really describes is how interaction in the world actually works. First you see, then you make sense of it, then you decide how to act, and then you act. And we all do that, and the state does as well. Any kind of state does that. I mean, and every person in a state does that. Any official in a state does that. So both on a human level and on a system level, we all go through these OODA loops all the time. And most anarchist philosophies focus on the DNA part, that is the decision and the action part. So what they really want to do is to rewrite the rules of a system, the decision-making part, and do things like change the way how law is created. So yeah, you have the syndicalist tradition, for example, that is based on local committees that then send representatives around, and that have this idea of having a big group of people coming to consensual decisions on rules. Mm-hmm. So that is one form. There are other forms that are strictly opposition anarchy, I call them. They don't really care about rules and whatever so much, but they want to prevent the system from acting. So they will burn down prisons and attack police cars and whatever, and basically prevent the system from having any active capabilities anymore.
So they want to destroy the system?
They want to destroy the system and not reform it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is actually a good distinction. You know, you have these destructive anarchists and you have the reformist anarchists, but they all target the system itself. They're saying, okay, we have a system out there and we're going to change something about the system.
And Cryptoanarchy doesn't do that?
And Cryptoanarchy doesn't really do that. So Cryptoanarchy is more targeting the observation and orientation part of the OODA loop. So instead of saying, we change the rules, we change the law, we change the way how law is created or how the state can act, Cryptoanarchy says, let's create a space in which it doesn't matter what the system already is. Mm-hmm. Let's find a way to ignore the system. Instead of reforming it or attacking it, let's find ways to ignore it. And the way to do that is to help people break out of the OODA loop of their oppressors by saying, okay, we help you creating technologies, which is not necessarily computer stuff or whatever, it can be behavior. We help you with becoming non-observable, for example. So the bathroom is a good example. The bathroom is usually a not observed room, you know. This is why you have Cryptoanarchy in the bathroom. It's because nobody is looking inside. So there's no observation of your actions. And because there's no observation of your actions, nobody knows what you have done. So they cannot decide on how to treat you based on what you've done. And they cannot decide on an action against you or for you. So in a way, you're undermining oppression by simply not being in the OODA loop of the oppressor.
You attack it in the very beginning.
You attack it in the very beginning. You're just invisible for them. That is the option number one. So you prevent the observation of the act.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, when it comes to the orientation phase, is you can also undermine the ability of the observer to attribute actions to you. That's the second big thing. So the difference is the action itself visible? That is the observation attack or the attack against observation. And the second is, can an action be observed but not attributed to a person or to a physical person, to be exact? So there might be a pseudonym, whatever, but there's no body you can go after. And the non-attribution is the other technology that you can work on. So they're interesting technologies that are ages old. So face masks is a good example. So imagine that you put a mask on and you go to a place and do something, and then you disappear and take the mask off. it will prevent, hopefully, anybody who has observed the act from attributing the act to you. So the act itself is still visible, but nobody can say, okay, it was Frank Braun, smashing that window. Not that you would ever smash windows. So these are the core two areas in which cryptoanarchy is actually active, as the non-observation, non-attribution part, preventing observation or preventing attribution.
Which kind of correlates to when you look at computer science terms to encryption and anonymization, right?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
With encryption, you hide what's happening, the observability is disrupted, and with anonymization, you can still see that there's something happening, but you cannot attach it to a person anymore.
Exactly. And that is probably one of the reasons why cryptoanarchy as an idea came out of people dealing with cryptography. Mm-hmm. Because it was exactly that, working with cryptography and working with cryptography for hiding things or hiding even attribution identities that made thinking about that possible in a way. Because we had this new space, the internet. So there was a time where there was no internet, and then there was a time when the internet came into being, was created by humans. And then people experimented with cryptography. And you had this new space, which was international, which was instant, which was relatively little regulated. And then on the other hand, you had people that dealt with how can we make our messages unreadable for observers? How can we break the link between sender and recipient? And out of that came the idea that we can have experiments with cryptoanarchy on the internet, and maybe on the internet create virtual places where we can actually have cryptoanarchy, where nobody is able to observe what he shouldn't observe. Nobody knows who's acting except for those people that should know.
So basically people started off with these new tools they had on the internet, and what these tools allowed them to, and kind of built cryptoanarchy in quotes out of it. Try to experiment with it.
Right.
Thought about what could they do with it, and I'm still trying to build these alternative structures.
Yes, though there's this other interesting aspect, and that is, if you take cryptography and you take the internet, then cryptoanarchy is a little bit of an inevitable thing that happens from time to time. So this individual cryptoanarchy just happens on the internet when you have those tools, without any central plan, without targeting it really. It just happens because of the availability of tools. And you see that, for example, when you look at the virus scene, people copying movies and whatever, and distributing them. They're not crypto-anarchists by choice. They're not, they don't have a political statement or whatever necessarily. It's
so they
just
act like one.
They act like it, it just happens, the tools are there. So crypto-anarchy happens. But that is the individual aspect. Mm. But if you can take the individual aspect and generalize it, you might get a system of cryptoanarchy. So both of these things we became aware of. And the unintended cryptoanarchy, of course, inspired everybody to say, okay, how can we make that better? How can we use that consciously to create new systems, to create new social structures? And I think that is the other really important part, is that cryptoanarchy is about social structures. So the non-individual cryptoanarchy is about social structures. It's our ability to connect with people in a new way, in a way that is not observable, that is not attributable, and that still allows us to interact with people. And how can we use that power and this this new way of looking at things, how can we use that to build networks of people? How can we build something like societies out of it, or groups, or whatever? And that is the more challenging part, especially because you don't have observation, you don't have attribution. You're not captured in the system. Cryptoanarchy in itself, well, the context of cryptoanarchy already comes without any of these standard enforcement rules. You just happen to be there. Nobody forces you to be the participant in an online community. And if you don't want to show up anymore, you just don't show up anymore. Which is very different from the physical world, where you happen to exist anyways. And just leaving the country spontaneously is much harder than just saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to connect to the internet today.
Or this one specific community.
Yeah. So the participation in a crypto-anarchist society is always a willful, voluntary act. It never happens by accident. You have to put effort in it, and which I think is it's a really cool aspect, because you cannot be part without consenting.
Which is a big difference to the state, where you're forced to be part of.
Exactly,
it's really hard to opt out.
Exactly. So being in a state doesn't require your consent at all.
They kind of try to twist it around with this like generational contract, but nobody ever signed that contract, right?
Yeah, well, it's political theory, and more like a way to explain things.
After the fact,
exactly. It's kind of funny when you read like constitutions and stuff, and they start with, people got together to create a government, and nobody says, who people, aren't they all dead? Why isn't the government dead? Well, I think that it's a little bit problematic to become too nitpicky when it comes to the government, and taking their ideas over, because most of these ideas are just ways to explain. They're not justifications; they're just ways to explain, and they kind of conceal the reality of the system always. So let's go back to what the reality of the system is. The reality of the system is you wake up in the morning, you become conscious, and you're in the territory of a state. And the state will enforce his laws on you. That's it. All the other stories, narratives, you can say why that is or why not, don't really matter. The fact is you wake up and you have to stick to the laws. While you're asleep, you don't have to, but the moment you're conscious, you have to.
And often you also have to stick to some rules of the country or territory you were born in, even if you're not in that territory.
Exactly. So
you kind
sometimes
of belong to some territory.
Yes, exactly. That's even worse, where basically you yourself are declared territory of a state, but
which kind of shows you who's boss and who's a slave there.
Exactly. They have homesteaded you. The moment you were born, you were homesteaded. But with cryptoanarchy, that can't happen. With cryptoanarchy, you aren't part of that system unless you take action to be it. And the moment you stop taking that action, that moment is when you're not part of the system anymore. So there is no such thing as implicit consent. There's only very explicit consent. You have to act.
Very progressive, these crypto-anarchists.
Extremely progressive. And it's the same thing. I mean, we're always talking about crypto-anarchy in the digital online form, but I think there are offline forms as well. At least they're imaginable. One of them is where we are right now, is the TAC0, where you are never part of this place unless you show up. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably going to be a whole nother episode.
True. I just wanted to mention it.
Yeah, it's a very important point. But I wanted to go back to these communities. You mentioned the Cypherpunk mailing list.
Yeah.
Would you say that was such a place, like a crypto-anarchist community, or how would you put it in the context of crypto-anarchy?
The Cypherpunk mailing list and the Cypherpunk meetings, I wouldn't call them crypto-anarchistic. It's where a lot of these thoughts were thought openly, but a lot of people there were there with their real names, for example.
But it was some sort of like intellectual breeding ground.
It was completely an intellectual breeding ground. It wasn't the only one. You know, it's one of many, and it kind of died in a way over time, and other communities were, in my opinion, more interesting, at least for me personally. But it was the intellectual breeding ground. Yes, the physical meetings and the Cypherpunk mailing list were a lot of people with similar ideas came together and could play around with those ideas together. But it never stopped there, and it was never really contained there either, you know?
Sure, yeah.
So...
But I think the first remailers were born out of that scene, right? And
yes,
people also used the remailers to participate, at least the ones who wanted to stay anonymous.
Yeah. Well, so I think even back then you had multiple levels of radicalization, so to speak. A lot of stuff happened, of course, on the Cypherpunk mailing list, but one shouldn't ignore that we had the Newsnet as well back then. And in a way, the more radical experimentation really happened on the Newsnet. So people would discuss stuff on the Cypherpunk's mailing list and other places, and then wrote code, hopefully. And then the code was used, but one of the things that wasn't solved at that time was recipient anonymity. So you always had to use pools to communicate to, and so you would basically send to a whole group of people, even if you just wanted to reach one of them. And the Cypherpunk mailing list was not a good place for that. You know, because you didn't want to get the spam of encrypted messages all the time. So what happened is that stuff like Alt Anonymous were more important there.
Maybe can you give a short introduction? I think a lot of listeners are not familiar with the Usenet anymore.
So you're telling me that I'm an old fuck.
Well, you're a bit of an old fart.
Fart, thank you. We'll talk about that off air. The Newsnet is, or has been, well, still is kind of a little bit. It's something like a distributed forum. You were able to connect to a Usenet server, subscribe to a certain topic or whatever, read the messages and post messages yourself. And the Usenet servers themselves were something like a federated system.
So it was a protocol like email is a protocol.
Exactly.
SMTP is a protocol.
Exactly. So it was a protocol plus a network. So the Newsnet servers would talk to each other and exchange messages with each other. So that when you were connected to one Newsnet server, you would also be able to read the messages from another user that was connected to another Newsnet server. And Newsnet was the first distributed communication platform. And at a point it was big, you know, like hundreds and thousands of topics, I guess. And most people on the internet used it once, you know, before all the CompuServe and AOL mummies came online, it was one of the main places to discuss.
And it was basically just text-based, right?
It was
plus attachments.
Yes, exactly. So it was text-based, but you could also put digital content into like files into your messages, and you had everything, from political discussion to local discussion to porn and various archives to religion to, I don't know, every strange topic in the universe was discussed on the Newsnet. You just had to find the right topic. And one of them was the Alt Anonymous and Alt Anonymous Remailer and Alt Anonymous 2. There were a couple of those topics that you could subscribe to that were to apart the more radical experimentation with crypto-anarchist ideas.
You mentioned recipient anonymity there.
Exactly. So in anonymity, you have three forms actually of anonymity. You have sender anonymity, recipient anonymity, and participation anonymity. So sender anonymity is nobody can say that you send a message. Recipient anonymity is nobody can say that you received a message, a specific message. And participation anonymity is nobody can tell if you're actually taking part in any communication whatsoever, like in a system. And for crypto-anarchist ideas, you kind of want to have both. Well, you kind of want to have all three, but at a minimum, you want to have sender and recipient anonymity. Because if you don't have a recipient anonymity, you cannot actually reply to messages. Because the moment you reply to a message, you reveal that since you were the recipient of the original message and that receiving wasn't anonymous, you basically destroy your sender anonymity the moment you're replying to a message. So to actually have interaction in an anonymous system, you want to have sender and receiver anonymity.
Why do you destroy sender anonymity when you reply?
Because you're referring to information that was that belongs to the initial receiving. So if A sends a message B to C, and then C replies to A quoting B, you reveal that you are actually C because you know B.
Okay.
So, and that makes it really important to have both sender and recipient anonymity. If you only have one of the two, that's not actually that much. You want both.
And that's, for example, with email, it's hard to achieve because I only get my messages. But if I subscribe to Alt Anonymous, I get the messages from all people, and nobody can tell which ones are the ones I can decrypt.
Exactly.
Which are for me.
Exactly. And mailing lists aren't that great for that, especially if you have clear text communication on the same mailing list, because you'll annoy most of the people there when you send an encrypted message. They're downloading it, and then, I got that message. I didn't ask for it.
So it's a bit like a federated gossiping protocol.
Exactly. It's a gossip. It still is a federated gossiping protocol, and it was actually relatively optimal for the use of spreading anonymous messages, because you wouldn't really have to download all the messages all the time. So you were able to say, okay, I'm only going to download messages with a certain subject, for example. And that would put you as the recipient in control over which messages to actually download and how much anonymity to actually have. Plus, the federation meant that you would likely be using the system through a different server than whoever sent the message in the first place. So the standard setup back in the day was that you as a sender would encrypt a message, send it to a so-called remailer. The remailer would post it on Newsnet. And then as a recipient, you would follow a certain topic in the Newsnet, check all the messages that come there, and then download either all messages and decrypt the ones for you, or download specifically the messages you wanted to get. And that combination would allow you to have both sender and recipient anonymity. Though, of course, that's a little bit idealized, you know.
It sounds awesome the way you talk about it.
It was a good time, and I used it all the time. And I'm not going to say what we used it for, but it allowed you to participate in conversations that were actually anonymous. And it allowed you to participate even in group communication that was anonymous. And the technology was not as good as it should have been, but it was pretty good.
In terms of usability or in terms of anonymity?
Usability was shit. It was always shit.
So you needed to be an expert to actually use it?
Well, or you were a Windows user. There were actually quite a few really good programs for Windows users.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they had like a graphical user interface and point and click and whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of that actually, and really good stuff. So, but
for
I was
Cryptoanarchy noobs.
For the Cryptoanarchy noobs, exactly. But if you weren't a Windows user, but you were like a Unix user like myself, then it was hacking together command line tools. So for the Unix users, it was like, yeah, if you're stupid enough to use Unix, you know, go all the way. But after, I don't know, 1 or 2 days of, you know, getting into the subject, you would be able to use it. And I got completely hooked on that. I have to admit that, you know, I really completely got hooked on the idea of being able to communicate with anonymity, sender and recipient anonymity, and to a certain degree, even participation anonymity. Because if you selected your Newsnet servers correctly, like from a different country, whatever, you would basically make the assumption that if somebody is too interested in what you're doing, they can't really find that out because it's in a different jurisdiction, and so on and so on.
So you also had some sort of participation anonymity.
Yeah, like a very, very shallow form.
I mean, I think participation anonymity is really hard to achieve.
It's really hard. It's really hard.
Unless you, I don't know, send all the data out through satellite or radio, and everybody can.
But that is exactly what happened back then. I'm not sure if it still exists, but there was a lot of traffic on the Newsnet, and one of the things that was actually a big thing back then was to broadcast Newsnet over satellite.
Yeah,
and we actually had this little satellite dish that would download all the messages from the stream and put them on our own Newsnet server. And so when it came to receiving, we actually got not everything actually, but we got the main categories of Newsnet, and could pick the messages out of it without ever connecting to the internet. And only for sending you actually had to connect to the internet. And you would then, of course, do stuff like send dummy messages, you know, like messages that weren't actually intended for anybody. So you would hide the fact of how much you're actually communicating. And you would also use the remailers for all the unsuspicious stuff as well, you know, because then if anybody was asking, you know, are you taking part in any of those communities? You would say, no, of course not. I'm just using a remailer to participate in /alt.religion, alt.religion. Judaism or whatever, you know. So, to some degree, you had participation anonymity already. And for a certain while, that was like all I did, you know, that was my place of living. You know, back then I was still in school, you know, come back from school and use my computers that I paid with doing really bad jobs, and participate in those discussions. And though it went further, sooner or later, you're not just participating in discussions. There was this point when the Mixmaster network was created. So maybe we should explain what a remailer. So a remailer allows you to send a message through a chain of other servers.
Bit like Tor.
A little bit like Tor. So your message would be encrypted to each of the servers in the chain. Every server would remove one layer of the encryption and then find out where to send it next. And contrary to Tor, it wasn't a synchronous network or a low latency network, where all your messages were piped through as fast as possible. But remailers use stuff like delaying and pooling, which meant that when you send a message, it would actually sit on the server for a certain while, being reordered with all the other messages that got in, and then sent out. And remailer systems actually have comparatively high anonymity, higher than Tor or whatever can achieve. They're not perfect, however. If you can watch communication for long enough, you can kind of figure out who's talking with whom, at least with most designs. And certainly with the designs back then, because pre-Mixmaster, it was really primitive. Mixmaster was semi-primitive. And the newer designs never got a lot of traction. But Mixmaster was the first remailer network that would allow you to chain remailers one after another, and it would allow you to run a Mixmaster node. And that is exactly what I had to do. Of course, I had to run one or two Mixmaster nodes and participate in that. But it really allowed you for the first time to have this international, global communication without anybody being able to see what you say or to who you say or who you are, with people that you never met, that wouldn't be able to find you. You could talk with people, and you could be sure that those people wouldn't be standing in front of your door tomorrow. Which allows you a completely new kind of communicating. And it is there where the more interesting discussions and experiments in the realm of cryptoanarchy actually happened. I mean, a lot of it was not even experimental. It was more like a pretending. There was a lot of pretending, or let's call it performance art. You mean
like you pretended to be like this hacker, but you were just in it for the tech and you didn't really know what you were doing.
Exactly, stuff like that. People would do that, or but I'm more talking about the pretending what is happening. So there people created myths, basically, and you had myths like this place where you could trade state secrets. Long before WikiLeaks or whatever existed, there was this place or this organization that would receive your anonymous messages that could contain state secrets and trade secrets and whatever, and pay you money for it.
But it wasn't really there. Right?
Well, that is hard to say. That's the interesting part actually about this whole relatively hidden, dark, whatever stuff is the people that officially did that claimed that it was just a joke or an experiment, but who can actually say if somebody else not actually did it? You can't. You don't know what happened there. I mean, we're all talking about stuff that we really don't know the extent to which something happens. Because it's cryptoanarchy. You cannot observe it.
It's a bit like these modern hitman for hire on the darknet myth. You're never really sure if it really exists, and you don't really want to try it out.
Yeah, because you like your Bitcoin too much. No, it's exactly. It's a little bit because there's no exhaustive way to observe and describe what's happening. It's really hard to say what is not happening. You know, there are certain things you can say, yeah, this happens for sure because I know, because I experienced it. But when it comes to all the other things, there's only plausibility, but there's no real knowledge. And at least in the beginning, of course, there were people that had these ideas, you know, and posted about the ideas and then pretended that the ideas would actually be in reality, you know, and then years later they said, yeah, I did that, you know, and it was never really true. You know, that's the only thing you had there. But that doesn't say that somebody else was much more quiet about what he did and actually did it. So, and on the darknet today, it's the same thing. You know, if you look at ITP network or Tor hidden services, there's a lot of pretend there. And I would say that probably 99% of everything is pretend. You know, it's people having fun, you know, it's trolls. But that doesn't really mean that there's not the other thing as well, you know, and because it's not necessarily observable what is happening, it's really hard to say what is really happening and what is not happening, you know, and that is actually one of these things that is a challenge for thinking about the whole topic of cryptoanarchy. And that is, how do you actually have something like a society, a group, an organization, etc., when you have this level of non-attribution on the one end, but also the lack of observability. You know, when you cannot actually say what's happening, how do you actually form societies in that context? And that is one of the interesting questions. You know, how do societies work when you cannot see what's happening? You know, how do you deal with those myths that come up? You know, I mean, for normal physical society, you know, when you have observability, if you have attribution, whatever, you also have myths that form, you know, but in a way, we have become less and less myth-based people because we can see more, you know, we have media and we have communication, etc. So we can actually more or less see what's going on in the world, you know, not like the people in the 1500s, you know, who would live off of myths. Today we can see. And then you have this new thing, cryptography, that allows you to go back to myth, you know, where you cannot see everything anymore. And it's a real challenge for the modern mind, you know, because we're so used to, oh yeah, we can know, we can see, etc. And then suddenly that's gone again, you know, that really fucks with the mind.
It kind of reminds me, like many years ago, we gave this talk about cryptoanarchy, and in the Q&A, somebody asked us, where are these cryptoanarchists? I don't see any of them on Facebook.
That's the point, exactly.
And I think it's really some sort of psychological effect that people think something doesn't exist because they cannot see it where they are.
Exactly.
But nonetheless, you know, you mentioned these systems which were clearly observable, like the alt anonymous user groups, the remailers. I remember using the, I think that was the anon.fe.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a very early, just one
hop remailer.
Yeah, but I remember using that when I was playing around with the BBS systems, and was really fascinated by the concept. But yeah, I'm digressing here. But I'm wondering, you explained these systems to me. They really sound awesome to this day, but they don't seem to exist anymore. I mean, there are no emailers, at least not in common operation. There are no Usenet groups that people use. You describe something like technology from the 90s. By now, it should be like very polished with great user interfaces, and it doesn't seem to be there. Why do you think that is?
First, I disagree that it's not there. So there is still the Newsnet. There are still remailers.
But I mean, I think we can agree that it got smaller, not bigger.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
It got a lot smaller.
Well, other technologies became more important for people. So one thing that we didn't have back then, but that exists now, is Tor and I2P, which allow you to have more real-time anonymous communication, granted with lower anonymity, but they're useful for the things that people are used to today. So to the communication behavior of people today. So back
just more real time.
Because they're more real time. Because back in the day, the web was relatively small, and people were still used to either use BBS systems or email lists, Newsnet forums. That was what people were used to. So they were used to, in the evening or during lunch or whatever, switch on their computer, which took 5 minutes to boot, then connect to the internet, which created certain sounds that I still dream about. The most beautiful melody on the planet, in my opinion. And they were used to intentionally communicate with messages and with software they had to install and all that. Today, we're web browser infected. So everything we do is just services that we use through a web browser.
With low latencies.
With low latency. Because you don't want to wait for 2 hours for the website to reply. And so technologies that allowed you to use the web with more privacy became more important. And all the communication moved towards web and to low latency. Relatively low latency. We're not talking about sub-millisecond communication. We're talking about you can load a website in 10 seconds or something like that. And that is simply where our user behavior went to.
But leading to a lot lower anonymity.
Leading to lower anonymity, for sure. But also allowing more people to use it. I mean, there are more people using Tor and I2P today than there were ever people using Mixmaster. Even if you account for the growth of total internet users and whatever, I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of Tor users today.
It became relatively easy to just install this Tor browser. And
Exactly.
you basically have to download one package and you go.
Exactly. And the effect of that is a little bit that for most people, it just became a way of privately browsing the web. Often, I mean, it's kind of funny, there's this Tor hidden service address for Facebook, so you can privately connect to Facebook and then you put in your login details. And identify yourself.
Everything about yourself.
Exactly, and expose everything about yourself, and putting your party pictures, drunk party pictures on the internet and stuff like that. It's kind of hilarious. But in a way, we have something like a mediocre version of Cryptoanarchy that is available, but it's more like a consumer version of it. A lot of these tools are now consumer tools. They give you more privacy against whatever corporations or the state or something like that, but they don't have the community and social aspect as much anymore. I mean, there are still places that are focused on anonymous communities, but there are fewer and fewer of those. I mean, there are a few anonymous IRC servers, there are a few anonymous web forums and stuff like that. But the influx of new people, plus the changed user behavior, the general addiction to social media and etc., has kind of led to a lot of these places losing members or deciding to become much less visible. So a lot of the anonymous communication communities are not reachable anymore. You cannot find them by accident.
Yeah, I think through the internet maturing, these places also received a lot more scrutiny by law enforcement agencies and stuff like that. In the early days, it was just like some hobbyist club of enthusiasts. But as soon as you have the first real bomb threat sent by a remailer, things tend to change.
Yeah, but only to a degree. So there's still, I mean, even when we ran remailers and we had police contact, or you run a Tor node and you have police contact, it's very unpleasant often. Sometimes it's really unpleasant, but you can still continue most of the time. The thing that was more problematic for the actual communities was the influx of idiots. Because the technology became easy to use and there were so many more people having internet access. Sooner or later, you attract all the trolls and hillbillies on the planet as well.
That was the problem the Usenet had in general, right?
The Usenet,
the AOL became ubiquitous.
CompuServe was the issue.
Yeah,
exactly.
And then you realize you didn't build in moderation.
Yes.
And that becomes a huge problem.
Exactly. And it's the same thing on darknet forums.
It's probably another reason why these communities tend to isolate themselves more.
Yes.
They want to select the membership to have high quality discussions.
Exactly. Yeah. So they hide more so they don't have to deal with too many people coming in. And they usually recruit from other places. So you observe, your social media, whatever, and then you say, okay, this is a cool dude, let's invite him. And then you also use a few more tactics to stay covert. So the whole question of participation anonymity is actually something that's becoming more of a thing today. So you cannot really hide that you're using Tor or I2P. I mean, you can conceal it a little bit, but you cannot fully hide it. But what you're using there, where you connect to, what communities you take part in, that is something that is becoming less and less obvious. So you have communities today that, for example, give one address per user. So you have a specific onion address just for you, and no other user of the community shares that, and still they all connect to the same system. But it becomes really hard to see that people are actually participating in a community.
On the network layer.
On the network layer.
Yeah, I mean, the server operator does know.
The server operator still does know. I mean, he doesn't know who you are necessarily, but on the, like for observers and even for the casual surfer, it becomes more and more difficult to identify that communities actually exist. Because some of those communities simply have no interest in getting overrun, and so they hide more and more. There are other communities, of course, or other people that from time to time try to have an open community again, an open anonymous community. But one of the lessons is that your biggest threat today is not the police, but it's idiots.
Then you end up with 4chan and Gap.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what you're dealing with. I mean, you have this crew of relatively young people without any ideas what they really want to do, but they are dopamine addicts and they're running around trolling because that's their culture. And you're not going to have a deep conversation with any of those people, nor are you going to build anything with them. And for some people, that is just too much work to filter through all the trolls. So they recruit in different places, you know. But those communities still exist to a certain degree, but they're hard to find, and you can't really apply to become a member, which is an issue. It's an issue for Cryptoanarchy as political/social idea, because in a way it has become harder to do things online, and we've never been really good at doing things offline as a community. And so that is a little bit of an issue to actually make progress in the whole field, and we have to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah, and I got into Cryptoanarchy, I think maybe around 10 years ago when we met, which was a total chance meetup. We just met by chance, and
well, I mean, hey, in a libertarian meetup by all places, yeah, crazy, yeah.
Which was totally, and the way you talk was like, okay, this guy has something to do with computers, that's for sure. And then we started talking, but I was really into these libertarian ideas at the time, and my background was computer science, but I still didn't really find the idea of Cryptoanarchy on the net. Yeah, and certainly no communities like that. Yeah. So that definitely was an issue. Yeah, and it's still an issue. Probably more so, also because it became some sort of. I think Cryptoanarchy became also like a hype term. Yes. A lot of people, they call themselves crypto-anarchists because it somehow became popular with the cryptocurrencies and blockchain and all of that. And now it's en vogue, but I think a lot of people, they don't really understand what the term means, or they just like the label. And
it's become a brand in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. But coming back to these tools, you mentioned that these you mentioned these remailers and Usenet, and became kind of like not commercialized but consumerized. Yes, with Tor and I2P, and made it got easier to use, but also lost anonymity. But if you could, dream up your ideal crypto-anarchist communication system, how would it look like?
That's a really good question, because what I consider ideal for me is most certainly not ideal for most people. I'm actually not a friend of this instant communication. I don't like that. I think that to develop my ideal communication system, I would actually go back in time. I would go back to Mixmaster and then advance on top of Mixmaster.
Why?
Number one, because the approach of having high latency communication gives you more anonymity. And so there's this triangle of latency, low latency, high bandwidth, and anonymity. And you cannot really have all three. Either you have relatively little payload but high bandwidth that you throw through a system, and you have low latency, and anonymity. That is one possibility. It's constant networks. You're basically communicating all the time, and everything is cover traffic with everybody all the time. That's
like Vuvuzela, I think, is something like that.
Yeah, I mean, most of the diners protocols are based on that, more or less. You have a ring structure in which you communicate all the time, and then you pick out the messages that are really for you, and you try to insert a message for somebody else, but they have enormous overhead. So at best, they're good for short chat messages, and they're not really good for huge user groups. So they can't easily deal with a couple of 100,000 people. On the other hand, you can have something like more constrained bandwidth, more payload, less bandwidth in total. But to have that, you have to decide between high latency and low latency. So you have to decide on how long it takes for a message to go from A to B. If you want low latency, like you need for web surfing, then you will lose anonymity. And you can see that in so many places. You can see that with traffic fingerprinting. You can see that with active tracing. You can do things like insert latency artifacts into communication to break those low latency networks. And that is the route that Tor took, or I2P took, is to say, okay, we want low latency, but necessarily you have less anonymity in such a system. And in my perfect world, we would have high latency anonymity systems, which is basically remailer systems. You can advance on the technology that was out there. I mean, there is a lot of theoretical improvements. Not a lot of that has been implemented, but in theory, you can create remailer systems that are extremely anonymous, extremely reliable, and extremely secure. And much more than any of the other tech we're using right now. But they come with more latency. Though latency in that context is really dependent on how much the system is used in total. And today we have always on internet connections. We have $40 little boxes that you can have at home that are little computers that run Linux. So that probably allows us to build systems that have well below an hour of latency, and still give us extreme anonymity. And I think that for me, anonymity is more important than latency. And I actually think that higher latency is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. I think that the ability to quickly communicate, like quickly respond, also makes communication potentially less qualitatively good.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can see that when you look at the quality of an average personal email compared to the quality of your average personal instant message.
Yes, exactly.
Things like that, or
exactly,
a blog post versus a tweet.
Yes, perfect observation. I think that is exactly it. So, I think that a higher anonymity, higher latency system is what I would like to go to. However, that makes a lot of things complicated. While it's great for sending email-like messages, it makes stuff like payments, for example, more problematic. Something like cryptocurrencies, standard blockchain-based cryptocurrencies with such an anonymity layer are basically impossible to use.
You mean for the network itself to synchronize the blocks?
Yeah. Yes, for the network itself to synchronize the blocks. So to use an anonymity layer like that requires you to rethink a lot more parts of the complete tool set, so to speak, of crypto-anarchist technology, at least when it comes to digital crypto-anarchist technology. Yeah.
It also means that you have to basically switch the entire use model of the internet, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because everything that is web-based now is pretty much instant.
Yes.
And then you have to, instead of, searching on Amazon, searching for what you want to buy, you have to download the whole catalog first, and
yes.
you have to, like a mail order
yeah.
things, stuff like that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The entire technology stack is built for low latency, and the entire user expectation is that every user is basically used to this low latency stuff.
Yes.
And that would all need to be changed. But
well, and I think in a way it actually is changing already. So because of smartphones, there's a higher tension between having the intelligence and the data on the edge, like on the phone, or having it in the net. Because of battery consumption and because of mobile network speed, more and more apps are giving more intelligence and more processing and more data to the phone itself to reduce latency.
And preloading stuff.
Yes, preloading stuff. So like offline maps are a good example for that. Even shit like Google Maps allows you to download the map for your area so you can use it offline, because otherwise it happens to be too slow often, or it generates too much traffic, or you might actually not have reception at the moment. So I do think that the user expectations are changing anyways, in a way, when it comes to dealing with machines. So we're not a normal user doesn't know or care if his data comes from the cloud or is stored on his smartphone. They don't care.
Yeah, they just care about the user experience.
Exactly. And you can have great user experience if you're able to push the data to the phone and store it there, and process it there. The only place where we are really addicted to the instant communication is between humans. That is where we're really, really addicted to it.
And that's where probably we could build communities with higher quality conversations when we go back to higher latency conversations, right?
Yeah, I think so too. Because if you know that it takes longer for your message to be received and replied to, it makes so much more sense to put more content in a message and maybe think about it more. So you actually have more actual bandwidth in the communication. If you have instant communications, then the information content of a single message is relatively low, and you have a lot of opportunity to correct what you said, etc. So the quality is low as well. But if you know that you have to wait, then you have to put more information into the message. You have to anticipate what the recipient is going to think about your message and stuff like that. It's a little bit more towards the intentional communication and not instant communication. I'm not really sure how many people want that. That's a different question. I personally, I so much prefer high latency communication. I rather read an email than have 100 instant messages, because usually the email gives you more information. It's better written. It's easier to understand. Though I think we have to kind of relearn how to communicate in that way.
Yeah, I think we definitely have to do that. But there is a ton of noise coming through instant messaging. I've just been offline it was just maybe 2-3 days. And then when I switched on my devices, I was completely overloaded with with messages, and with email there's a lot of, your newsletters and spam and stuff, but the actual emails, they had more content, and with instant messages there was a lot of YouTube links and stuff that I'm basically I don't really want to spend 2 hours or so to go through all of that. And it showed me how much noise you actually get through that channel in just a couple of days. And so normally I would receive that all the time. And
it shows you how much time you use or waste on it without really noticing it. But I think there's this issue that for us, communication is always not just a transmitting of the actual information in the message, but it's always a social act as well.
Sure, staying in touch with friends, with
exactly,
showing partner,
exactly, showing your friend that you still think about him,
or porn.
Exactly, yeah. And it's a way of letting each other participate in one's life. And we're really used to that. I mean, there are those stories, about couples breaking up just because somebody lost the phone and didn't reply to a message for several hours, and then, he doesn't love me anymore, So, it's become something we've been, accustomed to, the high frequency signaling, it's a social signal now, and breaking that is really hard, I mean, especially when you grew up with that, that's your main form of communication. You're really doomed. You're not going to have a peaceful moment in your life ever again.
Well, that shows that we're kind of old farts, that we can remember the time before the smartphone. And
yes, exactly. Exactly. Imagine that you have friends in a different country and you write a letter once a month and it's still your best friend. That's impossible to think of today, but it works, of course. And I don't actually think, you were asking, my ideal system.
Sure.
And my ideal system is certainly not everybody's ideal system. And I think that what's really interesting is that when we're talking about Cryptoanarchy, all those tools, all those methods, they're not centrally planned. They're different programmers, different designers, different whatever, that have their own idea of how shit should work. And then you have different users that are using it. And there's no state that tells you how all of that should work. And there's also not a big corporation that tells you how it should work. There's no Google, there's no Apple, no Facebook that tells you this is exactly how the protocol should work. It's small groups, individuals that experiment, and then you see what comes out of it. The issue, however, is that we are so used to the big corps telling us what to do, or media telling us what to do. So we adopt technologies today by people praising them instead of thinking about them and saying, which is the best technology for me. We have become followers when it comes to technology. Again, proving that I'm a old fart. When I bought my first computer, it took months to decide what computer to get, and it wasn't like you go to Best Buy, point at a box and say, I want this, but it was like, you had to select the main board, you had to select the processor, the graphics card, the sound card, everything, you basically had to build it yourself. And that meant that you made real choices about what do you need for what.
Yeah, I think we kind of have this monoculture in the technologies we use these days.
Yes, terribly.
You mentioned the different computers. I also remember that before the PC, you had like all these different home computers, and they were not just like completely different operating systems or architectures. Also, the software was completely different.
Yes.
That it was more about, okay, what
Atari versus Amiga.
for example.
Exactly.
So, and if you wanted the software that runs on the Amiga, you had to get the Amiga. And for the Atari, you had to get the Atari. And today it's okay, sure, you have the Windows world, you have the Mac world, but still it's mostly using the web browser anyway.
Yes.
And then you connect to Facebook.
Yes.
And it's the same with iOS versus Android. All the most important apps you get for both of them.
Yeah.
They maybe look a little bit different, but eventually it's all the same. It's a monoculture of systems, of software.
Yeah.
And so people don't really use different technology stacks like the ones you described. And
and I think that has this bad implication that we don't actually know how to think about technology anymore, because we don't have to make those choices anymore. We just get the machine, whatever, and then when it comes to using a service or using a specific software, we don't actually have the tools, the mental tools, to make that decision anymore. But instead, we're using it based on network effects or based on what is big in media or what our friends talking about, So there's a lot of this. I mean, it's something that I find really annoying in the cryptocurrency scene. I'm pretty sure that most people in the cryptocurrency scene do not have the mental tools, the knowledge to actually make a decision what wallet to use, but you have these experts or leaders or whatever that promote the product, and that product becomes it then, but it's not an actual choice anymore. It's more, it's a big following, there are very few people making decisions and a lot of people following, and the making of the decision is not necessarily based on technical arguments, for example.
Yeah, I think it's more about these days often what tribe you want to be part of.
Yes.
It's not like, is cryptocurrency A has the better technology than cryptocurrency B. It's more like, does A have the cooler people, or, do I like the leader more?
Or are they better on social media?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do my friends use already? And stuff like that.
Exactly. So a lot today is much more driven by network effects, which is actually sad, because when you look at computer technology, one of the interesting things in computer technology is actually that we can have different computers and still communicate with each other. That's
if we adhere to some common protocols on the lower levels.
Exactly. If you adhere to certain formats of protocols. And when you look at the internet exists because people adhere to certain low-level protocols and put common things very, very far down into the stack and only innovated on the very top. So they would be interoperable. And that when you look at stuff like, for example, email is the same thing. It's a service and a protocol. And 20 years ago, it wouldn't really matter who your email provider was. You had your own email server, or you had an email provider, and you would be able to communicate with everybody else using that protocol. It didn't matter which email software you would be using or which email provider you would be using. That was inconsequential. So it was only the technology, and it was not confined to little spaces. And today it makes a huge difference if you're using WhatsApp for communication, or Signal, or Facebook or Twitter, and even Gmail, which pretends to be email. If you're a Gmail user, communicating with a Gmail user is a completely different experience than running your own email server and trying to communicate with a Gmail user.
Which is pretty much impossible.
it is possible, but it's hard.
I mean, for the average user.
Well, for the average user, it's impossible. You know, you almost have to be an expert to make that work reliably, you know? And that is a development that I find, it's sad. You know, I find it sad that today we're more and more building solutions that are only lock-ins. And you have that everywhere, you know? People build lock-in solutions, you know? Your communication program is not compatible with the next communication program. You have to be a user of exactly that service of that provider, so it works, you know? And that, I think, is really harmful. And it's harmful because we can become dependent on those systems. And because we're dependent on those systems, we cannot replace them with an alternative that is more privacy preserving or maybe even anonymous or maybe even crypto-anarchistic in spirit. You know, we get locked into those systems and into the networks. And that has become a new form of political control.
And the data in these systems moves into the cloud, so it moves from your own device into the cloud. And a lot of the systems and the software, they also become subscriptions. So you don't own anything anymore. Even your operating system is a subscription now, like with Windows 10.
Yes.
And so you lose more and more control, which is an entire subject in and of itself, like the whole
I don't think
free software movement.
I think those subjects overlap. You know, when we're talking about crypto-anarchy as a political concept, which means making it available for other people. You know, crypto-anarchy as an ideology is about inviting other people and making them able to participate. And then all those questions of lock-in, free software versus non-free software, free hardware versus non-free hardware, those become huge subjects.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you cannot control your device anymore, you lose the control over your anonymity system as well. And then it becomes a very political thing. You know, if we are addicted, not, you know, physically, but through our behavior to things like Facebook, Twitter, iOS, Android, whatever, you know, and we have to use them, then the step towards a more crypto-anarchist system that is federated, that is anonymous, and that is under our control becomes so much harder. So in a way, I would actually go so far to say that we're actually importing a new form of rulership into our lives by using all of those systems. You know, we're talking about this, you wake up, you become conscious, and you're stuck to a state. You know, it's the same thing with technology often today. You know, you're stuck to your operating system and to whatever non-federated system that all your friends are using for communication. You know, you wake up in those systems, and the costs of exit are so high that it becomes almost impossible for most people. You know,
I think you can see that it kind of becomes a new form of rulership in the fact that a lot of states now trying to regulate entities like Facebook, because they realize now that it becomes competition.
Yes. Yeah, it's both competition and a tool of amplification.
In that sense?
Well, if most people, and I think that is true, are using social media today to perceive news, you know, that is their main perception of what is going on. You know, going back to the OODA loop, you know, Facebook and Twitter and whatever, wherever we consume our news and share our observations, is the O and the O, you know, the observe and the orient. You know, that is what we participate in and perceive of the world.
And whoever controls that controls what the masses are seeing.
Exactly. So if you're all stuck to those systems and you control those systems, you can shape the perception. And the decision and action follows more or less. Sure, you know, it's the same thing with crypto-anarchy itself. You know, we as crypto anarchists want to destroy the OO of the state against us, and what does the state do? Well, he controls the OO that we use. And that's the battle we're in, They shape the perception of us, we shape the perception of them.
Yeah. I think we touched on a few subjects pretty deeply now. We talked about anonymization, high latency anonymization technologies, which kind of imply also encryption, because if you want to communicate privately, you need to encrypt your messages. And we also just talked about how do we run these systems. We kind of need control over our devices. On the hardware level, we need to know what's going on there and be able to control it. And we also need to control the software and the data. Actually, we need the data under our control. So I think we kind of got that covered so far. But the vision we talked about in the beginning was a bit larger than just communication.
Yes.
So we want to build like this parallel structure, and what kind of like still being in software. We're gonna talk about physical things in another episode. But what kind of fundamental technologies do you see in that area? What do we need as well? Do we need a cryptocurrency?
I think there are 3, maybe 4 fundamental technologies. One is communication. We touched on that. The other is a very special form of communication. That is the exchange of value. That is money, so to speak. Then we need something like identity. And we need something like records. Let me say records. So the last two, identity and record, we need if we actually want to build a society, because then we have to be able to repeatedly deal with people, and we have to find ways on how to agree on rules and enforce rules.
What do you mean by records?
Well, I don't have a really good term for that. But ideally, if you're looking at a complex society that you're a voluntary member of, you will have stuff like you're making a contract with somebody. Mm-hmm. And you want to be able to know that the other person that you're communicating with signed the contract, agreed to the contract. And under certain conditions, you want to be able to demonstrate that to a third party. So if two people are in conflict, they might want somebody to help them resolve the conflict. And for that, you need a way to describe what the status of those, or the relationship between those two people is. Mm. And for that, you have to associate contracts and other data with identities. We have digital signatures for that. And ideally, you want a way to be clear on how the communication and agreement between those two parties came into being, how it was actually constituted. So you want things like you want to be able to show that the other party actually received the contract, and that it actually received the delivery of your product, for example. Or you want to be able to order events over time. So that is, I mean, that's those are things you only need in a relatively complex society. Mm. You know, you don't need that for smaller societies yet. In smaller societies, if you have communication, if you have value transfer, and if you have identity, you're basically set. Mm. You know, and
these contract exchange mechanisms, or the ability to reveal that a contract was constituted, that what you would call records.
Yes, that would be what I call records.
Some sort of registry maybe also would be a term there.
Yeah.
Where you can register stuff and then later reveal.
Yes.
So then in a way, the whole blockchain hype has it, upside down, because it's focusing only on putting everything on like some sort of public ledger.
Yeah.
Instead of focusing on the more fundamental things first.
Yes. Yes. I think you're completely right there. I think that maybe it is because we considered so many things as solved. So with Tor, we considered anonymous communication as solved, I think. So people went on to the next thing. And currency is one of those things that is actually a social system. Maybe money is one of the easiest to understand social systems, where money actually only works because you have multiple people. Money. If you're the only person on the planet, you never need money. You only need money if you want to exchange with other people. That's and even then, you only need it in a relatively complex society. And so and the value itself of money is a question of social acceptance. If you believe in something to be money and nobody else believes in something to be money, that specific thing to be money, then your money doesn't work. It's a tool that only works through social consensus, at least with the people you're trading with. But it is a really necessary tool to build societies that are actually productive. Productive societies need money, and actually anonymous societies need money. Like in an environment where you know everybody and you can find everybody, like in a small village. In a small village, you don't need money. You can do everything through barter. You can do everything through an honor system. Because when you get milk from your neighbor remembers that you got milk from him. And he can come over to your house and say, hey, you got milk from me. I need eggs today. So you can trade without ever needing money. You don't actually have to use direct barter in most situations when you can find the other person, because then it's an honor-based systems. And that works great if you only have a few hundred people. But in a much bigger system, like much more than 100 people, honor doesn't work anymore, because you don't have the ability to remember anymore. And you would have to create a system of record that, IOUs or whatever, or you use barter. But if that system is not just big, but also anonymous, then both barter and honor systems don't work anymore, because you actually have to settle. You need final settlement on something that is universally accepted. So an anonymous society requires money to be able to trade and to be productive. There's no way around that. So I think that doing cryptocurrencies was exactly what we needed. We needed that. If we did the best technology there is a whole different question. If it's cool to do it on the blockchain or not, it's a whole different question. But we needed money.
I agree. For me, I always think of this like the Cryptoanarchy pyramid. These three fundamental things are like the secure devices, communication, anonymous communication, and some sort of digital money. Exactly. Which ideally should also be anonymous, and a lot of cryptocurrencies lack that feature.
It has to be anonymous. In a crypto-anarchistic world, you have to have anonymous money. Actually, it has to be anonymous and untraceable, because otherwise all the stuff you gain from recipient, sender, and participation anonymity are gone.
On the communication side, you gain on the communication side, exactly. You lose it on the payment side.
Exactly, then you lose it on the payment side. Yeah. And then the attacks by your opponents come through the payment side. And we see that today,
And vice versa, right?
And vice versa.
There's a lot of attacks on more anonymous payment systems, like if you use, let's say you use Monero, but when you introduce the transaction to the network, you trace, then it's not useful.
Exactly.
So these kind of have to go together.
They have to go together. You can easily fuck yourself up by mixing technologies of different security levels and anonymity levels. Because you at least fall back to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And if you're really unlucky, the combination is actually worse than any of the individual systems provide.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that people often say, oh yeah, we have Bitcoin, whatever, it's so private. No, Bitcoin is not private. If you're not investing a lot of effort, then Bitcoin will break your neck. You cannot build a crypto-anarchist society on Bitcoin, unless you add a shitload of other technology that makes it private, There's
going to be a lot of haters for this sentence now.
Well, I don't care. It's true. Without extra protection, Bitcoin is just a public global record of your transactions. And we have blockchain analysis and all these things, that are really dangerous if you think that anonymity is an important thing. And if you want to break the OODA loop by killing the first O's, then Bitcoin doesn't in itself help you at all. You have to anonymize every single Bitcoin transaction, not just, a little holding here or there. A lot of people, just clean up their Bitcoin and stash it away. They stack their sats, run it through Wasabi or whatever, and then put it on a hardware wallet, and forget about it, and feel great. But it's the transaction.
Lambo.
Exactly. Save for the next Lambo. But it's the payment part that is really important to build a society. If you want to build community society and want to be productive, you have to be able to use division of labor, and for that you have
a lot of transactions.
And that means a lot of transactions. And those transactions have to be anonymous and untraceable. Otherwise, they don't help you build that society. You're just leaving a big record for anybody to interpret and use against you. And it doesn't really matter if there's algorithmic monetary control or political monetary control. That really doesn't matter so much, because in the end, they will just, knock on your door and say, we know that you have Bitcoin. We don't know which address it's on, but we know that you have Bitcoin. Now prove us where your Bitcoin is. I mean, we had those things in the past, when the gold window was closed in the US. The private ownership of gold became illegal. And a
lot of people don't know that, but it's a very important historical fact.
It is a really important historical fact. And so people were told that you have to bring your gold to the bank and exchange it against US dollars. And a lot of people did that, but not everybody. And those people that were widely known of having gold, a lot of them got visits, by, I don't know what kind of police it was in that day, but they got visits and those people and the police said, we know that you have gold, and I mean, there were houses searched for gold, and today, a lot of us Bitcoin users leave a permanent record of being Bitcoin users. You leave it on social media, you leave it on the exchanges with all the KYC rules, and you leave it on the network level itself. You leave it in the databases of the hardware wallets that you buy, and so on and so on. There are so many places that prove that you're a Bitcoin user. And you also have certain transactions on the network that are visible, So there's nothing that prevents an oppressive state to come check and see, hey, how much Bitcoin do you have? They just come to your house and say, give me Bitcoin, and show me that you don't have any more Bitcoin.
Then you're between a rock and a hard place. It's a bit like having an encrypted hard disk, And forgetting the password.
Yeah, and then the police comes with a hammer, and breaks one finger after the other, and tells you, "Hey, I want your password."
Yeah.
You have to be able to prove that you don't know the password anymore, or you have to be able to prove that you don't have any Bitcoin anymore,
which is really hard to prove.
This is really incredibly hard to prove, and you can wasabi all your Bitcoin as much as you want, You will have to hide everything, including that you're a Bitcoin user in the first place. So there's always this hope to say, okay, nobody's going to come for me, and hopefully that will never happen, But in a crypto-anarchist society, I want to be able to conceal that I even participated in that. I want to have plausible deniability, a really important word, plausible deniability of actually having any money. And
I think you can only reach plausible deniability in any of these technologies when you create them newly from the ground up.
Yes.
As soon as you integrate with existing infrastructure, for example, with Bitcoin, as soon as you integrate with exchangers and the banking system, and
you're doomed.
You're doomed.
You're doomed.
Then you fall under the KYC, AML regulations. They have your passports, and then you're already doomed.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have to build it completely parallel.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that the introduction of regulated exchangers in the Bitcoin world, or in the cryptocurrency world, was the thing that broke it. Everything else is kind of fixable, but relying on public exchangers that are regulated, that have to do KYC, that have bank accounts, etc., that's going to leave a record forever. And the oppressors can always go back to that record.
And we can see that we lost a lot of... we actually lost abilities there by not being able to do cash transactions anymore easily through things like local Bitcoin.
Yes. Yeah, I think the actual thing that was in the spirit of cryptoanarchy when it comes to cryptocurrencies was over-the-counter exchanges.
Yeah.
Everything else is like, what the fuck? Everything else is just recreating banking.
And that's actually the area that is most heavily fought, the OTC exchanges. There have been people recently being jailed for a long time for doing these kind of deals. So that's actually been fought. I'm not sure, but I think local Bitcoin completely stopped that now, or at least in most jurisdictions.
Well, no, in some jurisdictions.
Yeah.
One of the big examples is Germany, where they had to stop operating.
Yeah. Completely. And in other jurisdictions, they stopped offering OTC deals, and people got actually jailed for doing them. There has been sting operations. And at the same time, we have regulated exchanges, so it's easier to do it the legal way.
Yeah.
And so you're completely tied to the existing system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. The real good development that we had in between were Bitcoin ATMs that you could use to both buy and sell Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
But even they're more or less forced to do KYC in most jurisdictions today.
And the limits, they usually only go down, not up.
Exactly.
As in Germany, they plan to reduce the limit for gold transactions to, I think, 2,000.
2,000, yeah.
And it will only go down.
Yeah, exactly.
With credit cards, where are we now? $100 in the US for?
Well, in Germany, we're at €100 for prepaid credit cards. Yeah.
So.
Exactly. Yeah, the regulation in that field will only tighten.
Yeah. And
if you combine this trend of tightening regulation with permanent record, you're kind of doomed. You kind of have to think about how far can they go, and they can go extremely far. with what have I done in the past that I cannot erase from history anymore. And this combination is really bad. And the other thing is, if we don't reach the point where cryptocurrencies can be used for payment directly, then we will always be forced to use exchanges to exchange them for other currency. And I mean, there are those people that run around and say, "Oh, I'm Bitcoin only," you know. And what they mean with that is they have a credit card that is loadable by Bitcoin. You know, yeah, that is nothing else but using an exchanger to a fiat currency. You don't hold your savings in fiat, but you're still using fiat to pay. And that is not being outside the system. It's actually jumping into the system. You know, have every single transaction, not just on the Bitcoin blockchain, but also in the databases of Visa or MasterCard. You know. Which is stored in the US, you know, and which is easily searchable or retrievable with a simple subpoena, you know. That is like, if you want the state to know what you're doing, you use Bitcoin loadable credit cards, you know. That is like the I mean, it's tragically funny.
The double whammy of financial surveillance.
Exactly, the double whammy of financial surveillance. You'd be so much better off by going to an ATM and withdrawing fiat currency.
Yeah.
You know, and then withdraw big bills and then pay with a big bill for a very small purchase. You know, that's the moment you have broken any tracing, even if they recorded the serial number in the ATM. You know.
And even there, I think we can see that there's a lot of transaction you simply can't do anymore with cash.
Yeah.
You know,
True.
all these new services, you know, the e-bikes and scooters,
Yes.
Airbnb, it's impossible to do with cash.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And you also have the same thing. You leave a permanent record.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, which kind of brings me back to identity. So if we build this alternative structure, alternative crypto-anarchist society, we also need identity.
Yeah, in a certain different way than we're used to. Yes.
Like our pseudonyms.
Yes.
Something to attach reputation to, or?
I think that reputation is overvalued. And maybe we don't actually understand what reputation is for. I think that the need for anonymity, for identity, is coming in much earlier. It really makes sense to think about what identity really means. Identity, and I'm sorry to become philosophical here, but in my opinion, it's worth the while. Identity is saying that A is equals A. You know, that is where we get identity from. You know,
we're going real basic now.
We're going real basic, but it's in my opinion that's worth the while. So A is A, and that completely sounds trivial. But if you think about the application of that, then it's so much less trivial. Because, for example, if you communicate with a person today and then communicate with somebody tomorrow, identity is to say it's the same person. You know, I communicated with you yesterday. That is identity. And that is really fundamental. You know, only with identity, with being able to say, you're the same person I communicated with yesterday, only that allows us to actually have conversations that span a single event.
But in the most extreme case, it could mean that you could have a different identity for every person you talk to, right?
Of course. But when it comes to single interact or single pairs of people, identity is what allows us to have a long-term conversation, you know, and not having to start at zero.
Yeah.
And
in a way, some sort of mini reputation for that one connection.
No, it's memory. It's not even reputation. It's just memory. You know, at that
point. It can be bad memory too.
It can be bad memory too, you know, and sometimes you want to have the other person to have bad memory, you know, and then you change your name. But it is memory. And memory is really fundamental. Memory is fundamental not just for reputation, because reputation you only need when you're talking about more than two people. But for two people alone, you already need memory. You have to be able to integrate the communication with somebody into your own biographic memory. Because only then you can make progress. Only then you have history together. Only then you can have a long-term relationship, be it communication, be it trade, whatever. So that is the most fundamental part of identity. And that is the way in which we use identity most of the time. You meet a friend and you recognize him by, the face, by the voice, whatever. That establishes identity. It's the signals that allow you to say, okay, it's the same dude. It's my friend. And you wouldn't be able to have friendships if you have no way of recognizing a person. But recognition is something that can be very private. It can be only between two people. It's a simple thing as saying on the internet, hey, we talked yesterday and we talked about X. If there was a private conversation, only the other party knows that you were talking about X,
Just to bring that into there shortly, I just remembered that we kind of ran into that issue with our meetups. Where we introduced the mask policy and then realized it's really hard to recognize people over multiple meetups.
Yes.
So, and we now have to kind of solve the problem of identity in the physical world.
Without giving up privacy.
Yeah, exactly. So there was that issue there.
Yeah. And that is actually a good example of the research and experimentation we do here in the TAZ0 when it comes to making Cryptoanarchy into something that works in the physical world as well. Exactly. So good callback. Thank you.
Yeah. So we might need some sort of like QR codes on the face mask or something like that. We'll see. We will have to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. But let's go back to identity, and
sure.
and I think that's so the recognition, be it the QR code on the face mask, or being it referring to shared knowledge, shared private knowledge, or being it using digital signatures, or provable pseudonyms. That's what we need in one-to-one communication already, or interaction, and then it becomes really problematic if you're talking about societies. Because societies are not just individual pairs of people, but societies are networks of people. That means that you have, you want to be able to introduce people, and you want to be able to communicate about people. So I want to be able to say to you, hey, I met A. And that statement only makes sense if when I say A, it's the identical A that you understand when you hear me saying A. It's identity again.
So you kind of have to transfer that identity to me, saying, okay, this A here it is, and I have to be able to talk to the same A.
Exactly. So that is identity as well. And only that allows us to talk about somebody, to share knowledge. And that is where reputation comes in.
And that's also where you can vouch for somebody. Right?
Exactly.
Transfer trust.
Exactly. You can only introduce somebody to somebody else if both the person that you introduce and the person that you introduce to are identities. Otherwise there's no transaction you can actually do. You cannot address those people. So I think that identity to a certain part is relatively easy to solve with cryptography, because we have stuff like digital signatures. And that is really powerful. We can actually do things with cryptography that we cannot do in the physical world. So the easiest thing we can do with cryptography is to say, we're not talking about names necessarily. Somebody has a name, but somebody is in possession of a cryptographic identity, like a public key. and he can prove that he's the owner of the public key.
The private key.
He's the owner of the public key by also being the owner of the private key,
Sure.
which you can establish by making a signature, for example. So that is a thing that works really, really well. We can do that through the internet. We can say, okay, you identify yourself with your public key and a signed message today, and you do that again tomorrow, hence you're the same person for me. Well, in reality, you're only the same public key. If it's shared between people,
Sure.
then behind one identity is more than one person, which might actually be a good thing. Sometimes we want to communicate with organizations, for example, or with groups, instead of communicating with individuals. So that is one thing, but you can do more things. You can, for example, show group ownership or group membership. So you can use cryptography to prove that you're part of a group without actually saying who in the group you are, which is something that is really hard to do in the physical world. But with cryptography, it's relatively easy. You have stuff like threshold signatures, you have ring signatures. Those are all technical terms, but it allows you to prove group ownership or group membership. So when it comes to showing simple identity in a positive sense, that is easy. And positive sense means that the persons being identified cooperate. And that is another example of where cryptoanarchy and the physical state system might differ a lot. Because in the physical state system, you don't necessarily have to cooperate for your identity to be established. So, for example, today we have this pest of biometrics, where when you want to get a passport, you have to have a biometric mugshot, photo, you have to leave your fingerprints, it's signed, it's put on the passport. It might or might not be centrally stored, but as soon as you do that, you cannot prevent saying who you are anymore. Because the moment somebody has this state ID and your biometric data, he can always check it for being you.
And it's heavily used.
It's extremely heavily used. Extremely. I mean, look at China, for example, where you have these vending machines, or even ATMs working with Face ID, with facial recognition. It's insane.
And I'm so much looking forward to widespread faking of these biometric data for theft.
True.
That's going to be some.
But it's getting harder and harder. It's getting harder and harder because those technologies, they're not simple two-dimensional photos anymore. They're not visible light photos anymore. They're infrared. They're three-dimensional. Depth. They check if your face is actually pulsing. Because your heartbeat, pulses your blood. So you have a temperature change in your face with every heartbeat. They're checking for that. So it becomes harder and harder to fake that, which also means that in the physical world, the anonymity that you're used to and that is running around without anybody knowing who you are is going to go away in the future.
Yeah, it's quickly deteriorating basically to zero.
To zero, yeah. Exactly. And you have to use active countermeasures to actually not be identified, let alone you being at risk of being defrauded by somebody being able to break the system. But on the other hand, not being able to hide in the masses because you cannot fake those against those systems. So in the real world, you more and more lose the consent that is required to identify you. In the online world, cryptoanarchist world, in cyberspace, showing your identity is always something that requires your consent. You cannot be remotely forced to show who you are. You know, to make a signature or whatever, you have to participate. At least in good systems. Of course, there's stuff like browser fingerprinting, whatever. We're not talking about the spy machines here. We're talking about the crypto-anarchist world. But that...
It's kind of funny how it's this motive of force and voluntary interaction kind of repeats itself just already in identity.
Yes.
You know, the state system forces you to identify yourself, and in a crypto-anarchy society, it's a voluntary interaction.
Yes. Yes, it just provides the means that you could, but you still have to consent. Exactly. And I think that's fundamental, you know, and I'm happy that you emphasize it again, you know, because it's really the core thing of crypto-anarchy is that it's actually anarchy. You know, it requires your active consent at every step, you know, and you're not forced by anybody. And that is where the liberating factors of crypto-anarchy really come in, you know.
And I think it's also where you can really see the huge difference between the visions for the future. We were talking in the introduction a little bit about that. The podcast is about an alternative vision for the future, and what you just described was, you know, biometrics becoming ubiquitous. It's a future which is very much or even 100% based on force and forcing people into behaviors, into all sorts of, you know, interactions involuntarily.
Yes.
And the alternative vision is about voluntary interactions and freedom to do or not do, freedom to reveal your identity or not to reveal it.
Yeah, perfectly said. Perfectly said. That is the big fork in the road in front of us. You know, the future, if it continues, if the current present continues to develop as it is, the future is a system that is not based on consent, but only on coercion and on manipulation. Those two things are the foundational blocks of the future as we can see it today: coercion and manipulation.
And for me personally, I think that's one of my biggest fears, is that if we go too far down that road of coercion, where we're already going, that humanity as a whole will not be able to ever go back from there.
Yes. Yes.
You know, I think you can already see it in China to some extent. It's hard to tell when you're not there from the outside, but the reports we get, that doesn't seem to be in many areas like a system you can reform from the inside.
Yeah.
And in the more controlled areas, it's also not a system where you can actually build a crypto-anarchist society anymore.
Yes.
Because you're not even able to buy any computers without being traced. You're not being able to buy anything without being traced.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that even in if you think that reform is possible, I think that if you're a reformer, you always have to keep in mind that reform from a dystopian system, of a system in which you have a lot of coercion and manipulation, has always real costs. You know, you cannot reform without bloodshed often. You know, I mean, you see that in Hong Kong, you know. In a way, Hong Kong it's not been as far as mainland China, and people there are a little bit fed up with everything, and they protest. But that's not a fun thing, you know. I mean, it looks great, you know. You see the pictures of Hong Kong, you know, this great city, and then the protesters, you know, and it has a certain aesthetics, you know. But
it very much is like cyberpunk aesthetics.
Absolutely, you know, but get real. There are people that have real trouble there. You know, there are people going to jail. There are people whose lives are destroyed by this, you know. There are people dying, you know. The cost of reform, you know, might be horrific. So why ever let it slide that far that a reform requires bloodshed? You know, that is already too far. The dystopia is reached at the moment where reform involves dead people. You know, that is the point where you are already in a dystopia, even if you can turn back, you know, but by allowing it to go that far, you already agreed to have people killed.
And I think most, even the freer Western societies are already at a stage where you cannot have any sort of like fundamental reform without bloodshed.
Yes.
The corridor of political, like possible political opinions or where you possible changes is so narrow already that you cannot fundamentally change the system from within the system.
True. Plus, there are dependencies on the system. You know, we're not just talking about the bloodshed by reformers, but you might have people being dependent on the system unknowingly that suffer from any reform and terribly suffering from it. I mean, imagine something drastic like changing the welfare system. You know, there would be people dying. You know, you cannot simply reform that without deciding over the lives of other people. And that is where I say that is really problematic to make reform happen. If you have to sacrifice people for that, then you cannot reform into an anarchist system anymore. Because you're in the moment of reform, you are actually becoming an oppressor, you know? So it is really important to understand that if we want a freer system, we have to build it in parallel. And we don't reform and we don't revolutionize, because all of that would actually break anarchist ethics already.
That's a very interesting thought. For me, I was thought that, okay, I came to Cryptoanarchy after I, became libertarian and went down that rabbit hole. And I was looking for how do we actually get to a free society? I was thought, okay, we can start a revolution, which is kind of self-contradictory with the values of not harming other people. Or we could try to reform a system. But I never looked at it from the perspective that it also might involve bloodshed. I looked at it from the perspective that it just doesn't work. Yeah. Because I think it's like this libertarian idea of we're going to convince the majority that's never going to work, and most reforms never really work. Yeah. But you're right, especially when you have majorities of people already depending on the system. I mean, in many Western societies, more than 50% of the population are net recipients of state money.
And if that breaks away,
they will actually starve or die or whatever. Yeah. And so also from that viewpoint, we kind of, the only way to improve is to build alternatives in parallel.
Yes. So the only difference between reform and revolution is that reform happens within the context of a system, while revolution breaks the context of a system. Both of them will have victims, actual victims. You might not see them, they might not be on the news, but they'll be there. You're destroying livelihoods if you do that. The only way to progress is by having voluntary alternatives. And the important word there is voluntary. Voluntary for all participants. So if we want to have a crypto-anarchist system, or an anarchist system in general, then the only way to build that without getting into real bad territory when it comes to ethics and morals, that also will poison the future of such a system. You have to start from scratch, in parallel, isolated from existing systems, and not force anybody into your system. You have to invite them. They have to make a consensual choice to leave the one system and enter the other. Now, of course, that still can produce victims. You know,
because you're withdrawing also your productivity from the...
Because you're withdrawing your productivity from the main system. Now, and that will be an effect, of course. But that is only saying that you're not going to participate yourself in being a victim anymore. And if you want to soften the impact of your decision to change systems, you can do that individually. You know, you can decide to say, okay, 30% of my taxes go into welfare. I'm changing the system so I don't pay taxes anymore, but I don't want people to starve. Then you can still say, I take my 30% or whatever it is, effectively, and give it to homeless people, do something good with it.
And if you use the same percentage, you will probably increase efficiency, help more people.
You will help so many more people, because all the money lost by bureaucracy, etc., will not be lost. You'll actually select people that need your help, and those people will actually be people that are directly helped with all of your money.
And you might actually turn them into productive members of society instead of making them dependent on.
Exactly. They don't have to be the anonymous mass of welfare recipients, but they become people that are actually valued by a person. I mean, you can see that. I mean, everybody can make this experiment. You go to the streets, you see a homeless person, and you tell the homeless person, can I invite you for dinner? That there is doing so much more than any welfare check could ever do for that person. Because in that moment, you not just helped his hunger, but you helped his homelessness as well. His loneliness and his social isolation, and it did cost you less than any taxes you could have paid. You're actually helping people and not just pretending. So, but you can do that with a parallel system, because then every person switching can make that decision of saying, okay, I want to prevent the negative effects on the other side. But if you forcibly reform or revolutionize a system, covering that is nearly impossible. The complexity of that is far too high. You are almost unable to prevent victims in reform and revolution. Actually, I think it's actually impossible to prevent victims. But in the parallel system approach, with individuals switching sides, individuals can make the decision to, number one, not be victims themselves anymore, and number two, not create victims on the other side. And forget all the talk about, oh yeah, the welfare recipients are the recipients of theft. They're not the people stealing from you. The homeless guy who receives some welfare check is not the person stealing from you. Yes, he profits from people stealing from you, but he's not the thief, and him being made dependent on the system does not justify you letting him starve, So all these big concepts of, we have a libertarian revolution and we kill the welfare state, whatever. I think a lot of these things are highly egotistic, and I think that a lot of people don't really think about the effect of such a change. But with a crypto-anarchist parallel system approach, we can individually work on making it work for everybody, except for the actual thieves. The only people that actually lose with this approach are the tyrants and the actual thieves, which might help them find a different career and, having an honest job for a moment. So, but coming back to identity, I think there's this aspect that you mentioned it already, and there's reputation. And it's a big word in the crypto-anarchist community to speak about reputation systems. And it's always looked at from the point of this person has a good record in dealing with other business partners. But I think that one should step back and see that reputation is mostly a thing about being a good person. It's not just having a record of being a good person. It's being a good person. And us having a non-reformist, non-revolutionary approach and actually trying to make the world better for our fellow victims is what makes us able to actually have like something like self-reputation. You know, forget about digital, crypto, whatever, you know. The thing of you being able to make the choice to be a little bit better to your fellow human, even if nobody knows about it, that's your self-reputation. You know, that's where you can look at yourself and can say, okay, yes, I was able today to do something with impact. You know, maybe nobody else knows about that. And that's probably pretty good, actually, that nobody else knows it. But if you know that you were able today to do a little bit that makes the world better, that is really important. Nobody else has to know it. You know, the moment you do it for everybody else to know it, you know, it becomes a little bit self-serving again, you know, then you pretend to be good again, you know, and all you want is to have bigger contracts in the future because you're such a nice person. But this ability to anonymously help somebody, you know, that's a really great thing. I mean, there are those stories from time to time, you know, it doesn't happen as often as it should, but there are those stories from time to time where you have those anonymous benefactors that just drop envelopes with money into the postbox of some poor family. You know, there's no name attached. There's no rules attached. You know, it's just here. You know, I know you need it, you know, and goodbye. You never know who it is, you know, and with everything being traceable, you know, no cash, no blah, 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 you know, you cannot almost do that. But there's an interesting aspect to doing good anonymously. And that is, it changes the perspective of the person that received it. If you receive an anonymous gift to help you, you look at every other person out there and wonder, was that he or she that helped me? You know, it changes your perspective on all other humans.
And it also makes you, it makes it more pure in a sense,
Yes.
because you know the person didn't do it for to look good in the eyes of others.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of welfare or
philanthropy, yeah,
it's a lot about looking good.
Yes.
It's not about really helping people.
Yes. Yes.
It's a lot about, you know, looking good yourself, and also in a sense perpetuating the system.
Yes.
You have that in the welfare state as well. You know, that people who actually work in welfare and helping others, if they would actually help them, they would be out of a job.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the war on drugs. You know, once you succeed, you're out of a job, so you kind of want to keep it going. And
you can never do the job well.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think there's this ultimate beauty in this pureness. You know, this ability to do something unobserved, unattributable, and really good. It changes everything. Reverse that. I mean, when we're talking about anonymity, we're always thinking about the evil person. You know, we're always
the hitman for hire.
The hitman for hire. You know, the child molester, whatever. You know, there's this evil anonymous person. You know, that can go around. You know, and do heinous acts. You know, and he's protected by anonymity. You know, and when that happens, you know, we look around. Was it him? Was it him? Was it him? You know. If you do good anonymously, non-attribution, non-observability, then similarly, We look around. Was it him? Was it him? Was it her? You know? So in a way, it is really important, in my opinion, to change the view we have on anonymity and on humanity, and see that doing good or just doing right without being observed, without attribution, without receiving praise, without having public reputation, etc., actually improves everything. You know, if we could all be those silent people that actually have a good impact on the world, without any question if we did that for the praise or the honor or whatever, that could have a real big impact. You know, and it's something that doesn't require permission, you know, or shouldn't require permission. You know, you should be able to do good without asking for permission. You know, you should be able to anonymously slip a little bit of money under the door of the single mother in the house on the other street, you know, because you want to help her. You know, you saw her on the street, you saw that she's struggling, whatever, and you slip her money, you know. But in the future, where everything is coercion and manipulation, those acts will not be possible anymore. You know, even today, it's not really legal for her to accept it. She actually has to go to the welfare bureaucracy and say, somebody gave me money anonymously.
Then they probably cut her welfare check.
And then they cut her welfare check, you know. In the future, those acts of kindness will be illegal, you know.
Yeah, I mean, how do you even give the beggar some money if all there is some digital payment system?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, these Chinese beggars with WeChat QR codes, you know, that's so dehumanizing. You know, we're always only looking on the bad side of anonymity, but there's this good side of anonymity. You know, anonymity is a purifier, both for good and for bad. You know, people can do purely bad things because of anonymity, but they can also do purely good things because of anonymity. And you kind of have to keep it for both, you know, because you don't really have anonymity if there is a judge sitting there. This is a good thing. This is a bad thing, you know? So if you have issues with anonymity, then what you're really having is issues with yourself. You know, you're not imagining yourself doing good things with anonymity, you know?
Which kind of brings you back to this, you know, fundamental question. If are humans actually good or bad?
Yeah.
Right. And if you think that they're so bad that they cannot be trusted.
You shouldn't have democracy either.
Exactly. Right?
Exactly.
That they cannot be trusted with anonymity. You know, why do you install a coercive system of central governance? You know,
with allowing people to vote anonymously. Yeah.
That's right. Voting anonymously. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Which is a big value of democracy. Right?
And it's a necessary thing in democracy, actually.
Yeah.
They don't work without it.
So then it's some, you know, slipping this anonymously slipping money is some form of, you know, direct democracy in a way.
No, it's not. It is not democracy because there's no cracy, there's no rulership.
True.
It's a purely voluntary act of doing good.
Yeah.
So and I think that we should keep in mind that with all those control technologies that are built for the future to tackle bad things, we will also destroy our ability to do good things. And the problem with good things is humans are neither good nor evil by themselves. They're both. You know, they have both of it. And whatever they do more is what they become great at. You know, if you're a bad person, you do bad things, you become worse. You know? And we basically put ourselves on this track, you know, of if we want to become worse or better by actions. And in a coercive system, this decision of do we want to do good or bad is actually taken away from it. This is replaced by the decision of do I want something that I'm punished for or not? So you're not actually making a decision anymore about good or bad, but only about punished or not punished, which leads to people not actually doing good deeds anymore.
And it's kind
They
of
become worse.
Kind of closed and in this illusion of it's about being good or bad.
Yes.
You know, like, are you good schoolboy or bad schoolboy?
But it's just framing.
Yeah, it's framing. It's like, okay, if you act according to the rules, you're good according to the rules, and vice versa. But it's not about actual being good or bad.
Exactly.
You mentioned doing good with cryptoanarchy, with anonymization, with giving people money anonymously. But what about the bad guys? What about people who actually want to do bad things?
And you mean criminals or the state with that? I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. So,
mainly criminals.
Criminals. Yeah. So one of the underappreciated facts often is that people exist that are actually wanting to do bad, like actually criminal exists, and they're not just the product of their system. So we will have really bad people even if there's no state, even if there's no whatever hierarchy or something else, even in the most perfect society there will be bad people, and sadly you have to deal with them. You cannot always prevent them, and sometimes you have to deal with them, but you could prevent a whole lot. So there's an interesting thing, and that is in crypto-anarchist systems, stuff like property is bound to knowledge. So, for example, the ownership of your Bitcoin, Monero, or something else is bound to the knowledge of a secret, and only who has that secret can use that money. So it cannot be stolen from you without you participating in that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are quite a few kinds of crime you can prevent, or at least make so much harder in a crypto-anarchist system. A lot of cases of corruption, for example, are not necessarily possible in a crypto-anarchist system, because you're not necessarily going through a system of bureaucracy that can be corrupted against you, but you're going through a system of cryptographically enforced rules. And corruption through money and threat doesn't necessarily break mathematics. And so a lot of these crimes that are committed against you without you knowing it when it happens, but only after the fact, will become much harder in cryptoanarchy. And one can actually, speculate a lot, how complete such a system of anonymous ownership, provable anonymous ownership can be. There are developments where people try to do that for land and for physical objects like cars and so on, where you can have ownership but without being traced, and where you can, for every object, prove if it has been voluntarily exchanged or stolen. And that is something that I think is quite realistic to do with almost everything, at least everything of any significant value.
You mean just from the crypto, that the crypto is possible in technology?
Yes, we could have technology that allows that. However, there are still physical crimes. Oh, no, actually, let's go back to crimes on the net. A lot of interactions in a crypto-anarchist society will happen remotely, or at least by using systems that have remote components, and also in environments where both sides are anonymous, which also makes certain threats less likely. So, for example, the threat of somebody saying, okay, if you don't agree with me, I'm gonna come to your house and beat you up, is going to be less likely in a crypto-anarchist society, because they don't know who you are and where you live. You know, a lot of these coercive tactics, threats, violence only work if you have the control over a physical body.
You mean when you start with the virtual interaction, you cannot do the physical threat because
exactly.
You don't know who you're dealing with.
Exactly. So even for sales or whatever, you remove the threat of physical violence, because there's anonymity and there's remoteness. And that alone makes things so much easier. But in the end, we're still physical beings. And we won't be able to develop protocols for preventing every kind of fraud online either. So the common conception for crimes against property is that we use stuff like insurance and money that you put up as a security. And that makes crime potentially extremely expensive and possibly improfitable. If you cannot make money with property crimes, then property crime doesn't make any sense anymore. So that is true for probably all interactions we will have in the commercial sphere. But that still leaves us with physical violence. The interesting thing with physical violence, however, is that physical violence is something that is not remote. It's direct, usually. And it is, in most cases, something that you can directly attribute on the actor if you're in an environment that supports those protocols. So let me give you an example. It's actually a favorite example of mine, because it's from an extreme environment. And the extreme environment is sex workers. Sex workers are among the people that are most likely to fall prey to physical violence, because they're vulnerable. They often are female, offering their services to physically stronger men. They're not necessarily able to call the police, and so on and so on. So they're really vulnerable. They're much more vulnerable than most people ever are in normal lines of work. But if you're in an environment like a sex worker, you have to come up with solutions. And those solutions can be really good, or they can be really bad. So the really bad solution is the pimp. That is the strongman that protects you against your clients, but also will take a hefty share of your income. Mm. So that is usually moving from a bad place to an equally bad place. You know, the number of people that will violate you decreases, but the amount of violation doesn't. Still, it's preferable for a lot of women, because it's something that you can more easily calculate, because there's a certain predictability to the violence of your pimp. But it's not really a good solution. However, there are places where women came up with good solutions to do that, especially by using technology. And one of the examples there is from, if I remember correctly, Bangkok. I've never seen it in person, so I'm based on hearsay here. But the concept there is that it is the women work in a place that is constructed for sex work, and specifically constructed for the safety of the sex workers. They offer their services from a room that is separated by a glass window, and the potential customers walk down the hallway and interact with the women, see the women, etc. So
they can talk to them.
They can talk to each other, but there's a glass wall between them. And next to the glass wall, there's a door that leads into a different room that is reachable both from the corridor for the customer and from this walled-off glass room by the sex worker. And you can only go into that room if the sex worker presses a button in her showroom. And as soon as you're in, the door locks. And only then can the sex worker open her own door and go to the same room. That alone isn't much. However, the reverse is exactly the same. So to get out of the room again, the sex worker has to go into her showroom again, close the door, and press the button again. And only then you can open the door and get out. So if you beat up a sex worker, or even kill her, you're not going to get out of the room anymore. And then the cleaning crew will sooner or later find you and deal with you.
And even if you beat her up, she goes into her room, then she doesn't open the door, but calls somebody else.
It calls the security. Exactly. So this is a relatively easy to do technical solution. Has nothing to do with cryptography or whatever, but it's a protocol that gives so much more protection for the sex worker.
If the clients know about it up front,
yes,
understand the implication.
Yes. So the clients know. Of course, you have to communicate that. You have to say, okay, this is how it works here, and if you don't pay, you're not going to get out. And if you beat the person up, you're not going to be able to leave without that person letting you leave. You are at her mercy. So the power relationship is equalized. And of course it has to be communicated, but it's a really simple solution. It's ingenious. It's really simple.
And it's also a solution you can use in a situation where you definitely cannot use surveillance. I mean, you cannot really put a camera up in the room where you have sex work going on.
Exactly. So, and what the example tells me, at least, is that if you have an environment where you have to solve certain problems, there are often ways on how to do it. So even in the physical world, you can find solutions to have more security that prevents crime. And what will not happen, however, is that all crime can be prevented, ever. There are crimes of passion, etc., etc. But the interesting thing with crimes of passion is crimes of passion are personal crimes. They always involve a direct relationship between the people, etc., pp. And they almost always lead to immediate resolution, because the criminal has no time to plan, cover his tracks, etc. That will be the same thing in a crypto-anarchist society.
Sure, and we don't have to compare it to the perfect world. We only have to compare it to the current world,
exactly,
which is pretty bad already. So
exactly, and I think that a crypto-anarchist world would be better than what we have right now when it comes to physical crimes, especially when it comes to property, but also when it comes to violence to a certain degree, because anonymity itself is a shield for the victim. The anonymity for the potential victim is something that prevents the victim to ever be victimized. But it will not be a perfect world. There will be crime. However, cryptoanarchy is, in my opinion, also not an absolute concept. So saying that we are living in a crypto-anarchist world doesn't mean that in every single place and interaction, you're always completely anonymous. It means that you have places where you can be completely anonymous and places where you're less anonymous. And it doesn't mean that it's a place where there's no police. Just because we're saying anarchy doesn't mean that there's no police. It still makes sense to have specialized people that specialize on defense and pay them for their services, you know, however you want to pay them.
Like in this example, the security personnel in the facility.
Yeah, which is actually, in that story, it's actually the cleanup crew. You know, so they're actually cleaning the place and do security on the side, which is kind of funny. But anyways, so you can have those specialized providers, and you still can have places that have very high security. So, for example, the building you're living in can still be very high security. It still can identify users, etc. But the moment that you're leaving your building and you go to a public space, then the veil of anonymity falls over you, you know, or you go to a place like the TAZ0 and hopefully someday the TAZ 5000, you know, and a veil of anonymity covers you, you know. So you have gradients of anonymity that do not pollute each other.
I see. But what about virtual crimes or digital crimes like copying intellectual property or exchanging child porn?
So there was one easy and one hard one, right?
There are some in between, but let's stick to these two.
Okay. I have a radical opinion on the exchanging of intellectual property. I think that intellectual property is a made-up concept that only works if you have general coercion. That doesn't mean that producers shouldn't be paid for their intellectual products, but if the only way to get paid for it is to create a surveillance and punishment regime, then your business model is flawed. That's my opinion when it comes to intellectual property theft. There is no intellectual property theft. There is the copying of digital data, but it's a copying. You're not losing it. What you're losing is the license to be the only person that profits from it. And that license is built on coercion and only coercion. And intellectual property is such a new concept. I mean, imagine that most of humanity, like most of the history of humanity, we didn't actually have intellectual property. And apparently we survived till today.
I agree. I wanted to tease you a little bit.
Okay. However, I think that even there's a cryptoanarchist answer. If you really want to prevent your intellectual property from being copied away from you, you can still produce specialized viewing systems, whatever, do digital rights management, and try to beat the million of pirates that are going to break your systems. If that is what you want, please go ahead. You know, nobody's preventing you from trying to find technical solutions for that.
Or you just do private screenings in
You do private screenings, exactly.
Controlled facilities, yeah.
Exactly. So,
you kind of have to learn to keep the secret if you really want to keep the secret.
Right, exactly. You have to learn to keep the secret. And for a lot of cases, you don't have to reveal the secret. You know, private screening is a good example. You know, even if you record that, it's never the same, you know, than being at a private screening. Same with concerts, etc. When it comes to software, etc., you can use it remotely. You know, you don't ever have to reveal it. You don't have to copy it around. And I think that our intellectual property regimes actually have led to a really problematic tendency when it comes to intellectual products. And that is that it has become harder for people to produce new intellectual property and get it protected on the marketplace, that is, compete with each other. Because people that already have a lot of intellectual property and profit from it have accumulating returns that they can invest in protection and that they can use to litigate you out of your protection. That is a common thing when it comes to patents, for example. Same for software. And I think that's really dangerous because innovation usually comes from people that are not well established. And I don't think that in our current world, innovation is bound to exclusive licenses of profiting from it. I think that it is equally or maybe even better suited to share knowledge and not compete in the creation of knowledge, not compete in the creation of a certain product, but in the performance of a service. And I think that would be so much better when it comes to quality of products, etc. But it's a whole new topic.
It's a whole new topic for sure.
So the hard one.
The hard one.
The hard one. Depictions of, what do you say, child pornography?
Yeah, the extreme case.
The extreme case. So if you molest a child, I personally don't have a huge issue with you losing your dick.
Okay, but where do we go? How do we get there?
Well, how do we get there? So it's a relatively personal act, and you do the same thing you do today. So when it comes to the actual molesters, they are sadly often family or friends. And as soon as the kid is in a position where it thinks it can speak out, those molesters are usually caught. What prevents children from being protected is often that they don't have a secure way of reaching other people and asking for help, and not being able to talk with other people without the fear of shame.
So you kind of could also use, what would make the exchange of child pornography easier, in some cryptoanarchist tools you could also use to create tools to make it easier for victims to call for help, right?
Exactly. So, for children, it's a sick thing, You have a child that is molested, and that in so many cases the children think it's their fault, or it's normal. And at the same time, they're told that they shouldn't talk about it. That's the standard predator approach. Make sure that the child
don't tell it at home, right?
Yeah, exactly. It happens at home, usually, but it's about the predator telling the child, don't talk about it, and in the end, you wanted it, or you're at fault somehow. So it's this. The victim is really locked into a box of non-communication. And often the victims stay there for decades, often for their whole life. Because this lock-in becomes self-enforcing. Because you can't just go somewhere and say, oh, this happened to me. Do you think that it's all right, or it's my fault, or whatever? What you really want is that the child is easily able to communicate with other people without ever revealing who he or she is. So they don't have to feel any shame, that they can just speak openly. And then they can learn in that interaction that, number one, it's not their fault. And number two is that somebody did something really bad to them.
So some sort of anonymous helpline.
Yes.
where you can talk to a person via in writing, completely anonymous.
Without the predator being able to detect that. That's really important. You know, you have to create a safe environment for communication. And that means safe psychologically, you know, that is where anonymity is really good for. And also safe in the sense that it's not easy to detect by the predator. And which is really easy if everything else is anonymous and covered already, then it doesn't stick out, you know?
So in a sense, the real crime, as with the other real crimes, happens in the physical space.
It happens in a physical space.
Where you fight it, and so the digital artifact, the child pornography, is not the real problem. It is actually the stuff that gets the predator in trouble later.
Yes.
Because I mean, it's what you can use to prove what he did.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. However, that still makes the sharing of that a problem. Now, we don't actually know what the effects of child pornography are. You know, there's this issue that some people are pedophiles even if they don't want it. You know, most people don't make the choice of being a pedophile, you know, and they become consumers of pedophile. Yeah. You know, they look at child porn.
And it's not clear if it actually increases crime or reduces crime.
Exactly. So for some, it is probably something that prevents them from actually abusing a child themselves. For others, it gives them ideas. So we don't really know how that happens. There's another big part of consumers, and that is control freaks. So there's a huge correlation between authoritarianism and sexual violence, because using sexual violence on somebody is, short of murder, the biggest demonstration of power. So that is why those two often come together. That is why sexual murder is so common. And it's not about, for those people, it's not about the sexual act, but it's about degrading, it's about exercising power, etc. They're control freaks. And that is often also seen that people in authority have a higher probability of actually being sex offenders. Especially when it comes to the consuming of child porn, etc. So teachers, bureaucrats, politicians, etc. have a really high probability of falling into that category of crime, because it's an exercise of power.
So if we reduce authoritarianism through cryptoanarchy, we're kind of reducing the problem on this side. We kind of make it easier on the other side, but we don't know what the balance will be.
Yes, we don't know what the balance will be.
Yeah. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't change anything in the first place, of course.
So what I kind of dislike a little bit often in the libertarian scene is that the problem of child pornography is talked down to. You know, people say it's not a real crime, blah, blah, blah. I really hate that. I think that universally people should understand that the production of child pornography requires the use of coercion and or manipulation against a victim. And
because it's not like normal porn that where somebody can consent. A child cannot consent. So
well, the child might consent at some point, but usually they don't. You know, usually they're exploited. You know, that's the norm in all those depictions. You know, and so claiming that it's a non-problem is a problem. You know, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a bad comparison, you know, but it's the same thing as saying, documentation about the Holocaust is not a problem, you know? Well, it's the same thing. Both of them are documentations about people making themselves rulers over people, you know, that the whole thing exists is a problem, you know? The bits themselves don't constitute a problem, but they have to be produced, and the production is always a problem, Plus, I think that there's an additional aspect to that when it comes to crypto-anarchist ethics. I think that when we want to have anonymity for ourselves, privacy for ourselves, we always have to respect that in other people. So, consuming and sharing media that was produced unconsensually, that breaks privacy, that breaks anonymity, etc., is actually you giving up your rights on those values themselves. The child has not agreed on being depicted like that. It's like doxing. In the crypto-anarchist world, you don't dox people. And you don't consume doxing. Or revenge porn, or child pornography, or whatever. It is universally evil, no matter if it's involving sex or not.
Mm. Okay.
But I'm not claiming that it can be prevented. There will be, sadly, always child abuse, and there will always be revenge porn, and all of these things will always exist. And the interesting thing is that they cannot be prevented without having a universal surveillance state. Some crimes you simply cannot prevent, and many crimes you cannot punish. Most crimes actually go unpunished today, right now. Most crimes are never solved in that area and in many other areas. I think the only thing that is relatively highly solved is crimes of passion. Murder, etc.
Because they're the relationships are so close that it's kind of easy to track the people.
Exactly. Yeah. But most other crimes, you have really, really bad rates of solving them. And I think that tells us that one of the focus points must be on making it easier to prevent crimes. Just after the fact, cleaning up is not a good idea because it doesn't solve anything. Like
with the sex work example, it prevents crimes. So.
You want to prevent crime, first prevent crime and then deal with the crime you couldn't prevent, but the focus should always be on prevention.
It's like with health.
It's like with health, don't get sick, the doctor is not the best solution.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, I think that covers it. We talked about it in the beginning, why we think crypto-anarchy is a good idea. But maybe it would make sense to add some more reasons why it is something we would like to have more of.
I think we talked about the ethical aspects in the beginning, that anarchy is the more ethical choice, and that under the anarchies, crypto-anarchy is maybe the only real choice.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that, reform actually hurts people. Revolution is self-contradictory.
Exactly.
But maybe there are more reasons.
Yeah. So I think that there are at least two big reasons. One is arguable, and that is how we look at the future. If we look at what is happening today when it comes to technology in general, we have so much surveillance, we have so much manipulation, we have algorithms here and autonomous systems there, we have biometrics and all that. So we have a lot of technologies today that are ripe for abuse. And I think we can agree that just because somebody is in power doesn't make him a good person. You would prefer only good people being in power if there's power, but we don't have a solution for that. We're not having a good filter,
Definitely
quite the contrary. There's good reason to think that giving people power actually makes them worse.
And there's also good reason to think that if you have a system of power, you can attract the people who are interested in power.
Exactly.
You attract the psychopath.
Exactly. You attract the bad people to power. And when you combine that with technologies that are highly amplifying the power that you can exercise about people, track them, trace them, manipulate them, push them around, etc., then you have two options. You have option number one, you can make the technology go away. That's not going to happen.
Go back to the Stone Age.
Going back to the Stone Age, not going to happen. So that is number one. Number two is we can try to not have powerful people. That's not going to work in itself either.
That requires a big amount of genetic engineering.
That requires genetic engineering that we don't know how to do.
And which isn't necessarily ethical.
Yeah, exactly. So the only thing that is left is defensive systems. So we can build counter technologies that limit the effect of bad technologies, limit the amplification of power, and hopefully in that way create less systems of power or reduce systems of power or have alternative systems with less power. And I think it's really important to understand that the future we're really walking towards to is not that cool. You know, just because it looks slick and hipster doesn't make it nice. When you look at only two trends, that is surveillance and automatic enforcement, then that is scary as hell. So when it comes to surveillance, we are living today in a world that is so deeply surveilled that there's no historic precedent for that. The amount of information collected today about every single individual automatically, without a human interest behind it or a specific individual interest behind it, is so much that the secret police of Eastern Germany, the KGB, etc., they could only dream of that. You know, I mean, even they probably didn't dream of it and said, maybe that's going too far. Actually, I think that a lot of those people would have said, okay, maybe that's going too far, you know? But today we do that with everybody all the time, you know, cell phones, internet, payment, everywhere, you know, and that is only 10% of the rollout technology at most, you know? If you add all the biometric, all the CCTV, all the pattern recognition, machine learning, etc., we are talking about complete and utter surveillance everywhere. And then we combine that with algorithmic enforcement. You know, we have scoring, you know, how much money can you withdraw from your bank account? You know, we have that with can you go over a border or not? Are you security risk? Should you get welfare? Should you get a certain job? Etc., etc. We have scoring everywhere right now. But it's going further. There's a drive for efficiency everywhere. And that is true for the states as well. So state decisions are more and more automated. So we have the first, for example, digital judges, which are machine learning / expert systems that help judges, help in quotes, judges to make judgments on people and decide how long to send them to jail based on surveillance data. And then just a few years in the future, we have autonomous violence machines. We are talking today about the ethical implications of having autonomous robots making kill decisions. It's a huge topic in politics. And it's a huge topic not because it's impossible, but because it's already done. And the technology is already there. And the technology is becoming dramatically cheaper and wider spread. And it is more than conceivable to believe that in the future we will have more enforcement at every step, including stuff like machines deciding if you should be arrested, if you should get a job, etc. And I give you my personal symbol of that horror. And that symbol is automatic border checks. So we have that here at several airports already, where you're not actually interacting with a customs enforcement agent or border police, but you're interacting with a machine. You put your passport on a scanner, then you look into a camera, you might have to answer a few questions that the machine asks you, and then you're let through or not. This technology is relatively new. You know, it's been in use maybe 3-4 years. But there are already companies talking about using exactly the same technology for access to trains, even domestically, or to public transportation in cities, subway, etc. There are people trying to sell the same technology for access to living quarters. Now imagine a world in where a machine makes decisions about your every move, if you're allowed to go a place, where a machine based on enormously much surveillance data and combined with rules that you never saw and you will never be able to check, makes decisions what you can buy, where you can go, what job you have, whom to marry, etc. Imagine such a world, and we're walking into that world right now. You know, I mean, we have this trend already that machines make decisions about who to marry. You know, that sounds crazy. You know, but
in a sense, online dating is like that.
That is exactly what online dating is. You know, you go to an online dating platform, and you have an algorithm that pre-selects who might be a match or not by rules that nobody really knows, you know, and that you specifically as a user don't know, you know. It's for me, this idea that we have an anonymous, hidden rule-making system that we cannot opt out from, that is completely automated, that we cannot subvert. That's for me the end of humanity. It sounds pathetic, right? But for me, that's the end of all the flexibility, the autonomy, the creativity, the dirtiness of what makes humans humans. You know, the ability to make mistakes. You know, and maybe even discover something good in the mistake. You know, instead, if we have this world of complete surveillance and automation, there's only one thing, one skill you as a human have to have, and that is conform.
Yeah, and it's actually very vicious that it's this, on the outside it's a good looking drive for efficiency that drives the entire process. You know, you have let's say what you already have in China, face recognition and cameras used to enforce jaywalking.
Yeah,
where you could argue, okay, it makes it more efficient. But if you just, you know, project it a little bit in the future, it will be like, okay, we want to optimize the health budget.
Yeah.
So we automatically enforce rules or punish you for eating unhealthily.
Yeah.
Yeah, or smoking. And so, like you said, you basically the skill you're rewarded for is adhering to those rules.
Yeah.
And then
often rules that you don't actually know.
Yeah, right. And you don't even know who made the rules. There's nobody to talk to change the rules, and everybody kind of becomes like a cog in the machine.
Yes.
where it's even unclear what the machine is supposed to do.
Yes.
It's just about everybody's being like efficient in being a cog.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that number one, that is completely dehumanizing. You know, I know that there are people that have this vision that there can be a completely clean, nice world. I know that. You know, there are people that think we can live in the perfect world. I think you can't help those people. You know, you can't help people that have this utopist drive. Because every utopia that we build will turn into a dystopia. You know, a dystopia is a utopia that we couldn't reach. You know, because the basic misunderstanding of people thinking that there can be a perfect world is people think that they can have perfect knowledge, perfect moral knowledge, perfect ethical knowledge, perfect economic knowledge, etc. People that think that we can live in a perfect world think that perfection is actually knowable, that we can know what perfection actually is. And I find that unparalleled hubris. You know, that's in theology, that is what you would ascribe to God. You know, God may know what is perfect, you know, but I'm pretty sure that humans don't know what perfection is, especially because it might change. You know, who tells you that the next ruler doesn't have a very different idea about what perfection is? And then you have all those surveillance records that can be used against you, you know, to find out that you're not perfect.
Well, I mean, even with current ideologies, I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine that, you know, if you take certain trends in the, let's say, ecological movement a bit further, that you would say, okay, we now have this surveillance system, we have rules enforcement, let's reduce the population size by 95%.
Yeah, but that would be unethical.
Well, then you do it the ethical way. You just, you know, make it more expensive to have kids, or you know, whatever. It's very easy then to enforce these things.
Right, and I think what is even more scary in that regard is that I don't actually think that bad plans like that have to be made. They often happen. You know, sometimes we have really good intentions, but the combination of those good intentions and enforcing them on other people leads to really bad results. And
of course,
you know, there's this saying that the path to hell is made out of good intentions. You know, I think that is really true, because there is this fundamental unknowing of consequences that we have.
And I think even what a lot of people underestimate is that, let's say, take such a system and do not change any rules, but you just crank up the enforcement to maximum.
Yes.
You know, imagine, you know, every speeding rule, every behavior rule, every rule that we already have, 90% of which are not enforced, will be like
constantly 100%
enforced and punished. You know, that would already be like a super dystopian society. And that doesn't even include, you know, adding new rules.
Yes. I mean, there are, of course, those people that say, okay, if it goes too far, we can always fix it, you know, because democracy. And I think there's a thing to really realize, and that is the amplification that we get through technology shifts the balance between rulers and the ruled. And that means that technology is actually one of the indicators that speak towards what kind of system you get. So there's this nice correlation between political systems and offensive weapons. That offensive weapons, when they require a lot of people to operate, political systems become more democratic. If they require less people to operate, they become more feudalist. And if we imagine current surveillance, control, and enforcement technologies to be wider spread, you need so much less people to actually run the system, which makes it so much less necessary to have democracies. And even today, if you look at the trends in democratic states, is that politicians more and more orient themselves towards international organizations and not so much towards their own population. So internationalism can be a good thing and a bad thing, but it undermines the effect that individuals in society have, and even bigger groups in societies have. Plus, we have the spread of polarization, fracturing, etc. by social media or mass media in general right now. So it is a really bad bet to think that our systems can be fixed by themselves, because there's no good reason why they should. There's no pressure why they should. And there is less and less reason to think that the people will be able to organize in big enough numbers to change anything. Because they can't agree on anything anymore.
Which I think you can already see in a lot of these current events, that it's basically impossible to, or very, very hard to change anything.
Yes.
I mean, you see it in Hong Kong, you see it with Brexit, you see it with Extinction Rebellion. There are a lot of big movements where that people try to change something, and very little is actually changing. And a lot of energy is spent trying to change something.
Yes.
And like you said, the organizations or the power structure are actually becoming larger. So you also have some sort of, monoculture of rules. It becomes homogenized.
Yes.
Right.
And that is a really important word you're saying there, monocultures. One of the things that are positive about rules that are not completely enforced is that it means that multiple rules can exist at the same time, even conflicting rules. And that prevents monocultural developments. So the more systems you have, smaller systems you have in which there are rules, so the horizon of a rule is relatively small, or the enforcement of a rule is not absolute. That means that you can have a lot of variety. But the moment that variety goes away, those rules create monocultures. And monocultures have a few big issues. Number one is they're really, really hard to adapt to changes in the environment. So if anything happens outside of the actual rule system itself, a monoculture has a hard time developing strategies to deal with that. And the other thing is that monocultures are very vulnerable to systemic threats. So if you find a problem in the rules that you can use to overcome one member of such a society, in a monoculture you just multiply that and you can overcome the whole society. That is how in biology, for example, so if you have a field or many fields with the same crop on it, then you just have one pest that has to overcome the defenses once, and you wipe out all the crop, and or you have a change of weather, and it leads to all the crop failing. So monocultures are brittle. They're systems that are easily failing, and when they fail catastrophically. Which means that if you're having a society that strongly enforces a lot of rules deeply, that society becomes a threat to all its members. because you introduce one attack to such a society and you can wipe it out. I mean, it's so bad that if it hits a field like economics or energy or water or food production or communication, etc., and any of those systems fails, it means that it becomes a real life and death situation for individuals. So the perfect world in which every perfect rule is enforced all the time is actually a guaranteed death of that civilization.
And if you only have one civilization left, then...
And if you only have one civilization left, then it's the death of humanity. And that makes it really important to have very different systems, as different as possible, you know, and have a lot of them. Ideally, you don't have a few hundred societies like we have today on the planet, but ideally you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions maybe even of societies that can individually adapt, individually learn, individually defend themselves.
But still interact with each other. Yeah.
So the protocol for interaction must be as minimal as possible. And it doesn't have to be global either. You know, it's enough if it works between neighbors, you know. But you want to have as many entities as possible because it makes it more innovative, more adaptable, and much more survivable. And whenever something goes wrong, the effects are smaller. And that doesn't mean that those societies cannot learn from each other. You know, I mean, that's a good thing. If you have communication, then you can observe what really works and you can spread that knowledge fast. But because the societies are small, they can adapt to new knowledge quick, which also means that if such a learning creates a monoculture, you can step away from that quickly again and develop in a different direction. And I think that our current trends of, you know, internationalization, surveillance, automatic enforcement, etc., we are really creating monocultures on this planet. Very few of them, actually. And they are very rigid in some areas. You know, in some areas they're relatively liberal, but in other areas they're extremely rigid. And if we make any mistake there or the environment changes, and I'm not just talking about climate, but anything, the circumstances change. Those monocultural societies might become a death trap.
Yeah, I mean, just if you just look at basic technologies, let's say mobile phones, they're two big operating systems.
Exactly.
And which are basically controlled by two corporations, both mostly located in the US.
Yep.
And if they, you know, take apps, pull them out of the app stores, things like that. I mean, this alone, because so many other systems are tied into mobile phones and the apps on mobile phones. This alone is a huge threat.
Yeah. So I think that these systemic problems, so we have like ethical issues, we have dystopian issues maybe, and we have the systemic issues. If you take them together, we really have to understand, I think, and realize that the path we're on right now is a really bad idea. We're going in an extremely bad direction. And we need alternatives. We need peaceful, parallel alternatives.
And for me, at least, very surprisingly, I think very few people actually realize that.
Yes.
That we are on that path. There's a lot of concern about, let's say, environmental problems, but the systemic problem we're facing here in regards to these technological developments, very few people actually realize that.
Yeah.
And often when they do realize it, the answer is more controlling technology.
Yeah.
So, well, I think you painted a pretty dim picture right now of the threat, and
there's hope.
there's hope. I think we touched on a lot of subjects in regards to cryptoanarchy and what it implies, and a lot of these topics, they warrant an episode in and of itself, which we will do in the future. But I think we should give some sort of outlook. Or let's say, okay, cryptoanarchy wins, or cryptoanarchy, becomes more widespread. Let's be more realistic. It becomes more widespread. Some of these technologies we discussed will be implemented, become more widespread. What do you think? What kind of, implications would that have, in other areas which are not strictly technological? Let's say, in the physical realm, social aspects, cultural aspects.
Number one is that I think it will lead to more diversity in culture, more diversity in architecture, more diversity in food, in everything. The moment you can innovate with less control, less judgment, etc., you can experiment more, and you can present choices that were never there before. So that is like the big picture, which in a way will be a little bit more chaotic on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a chaos that is dealable. There's chaos that is unpredictable, sudden, and evil, and there's chaos that is fun because you know how to handle it. And I think the crypto-anarchist vision gives you tools to handle chaos and create positive chaos. So, like
evolution, create a lot of different solutions. Some of them are not so good, but the whole process actually improves itself.
Exactly. With the difference that evolution has a relatively brutal selectors. And I think that when you have cryptoanarchy and humans, there are far less selectors out there. So we will have more options, viable options, positive options that can exist in parallel. So I think one of the interesting things with cryptoanarchy, for example, is that if you're able to protect your society with anonymity, have non-observation, have non-attribution, you have the freedom to implement very different social concepts. So I actually think that some people will like to operate crypto-anarchist communist systems that are completely voluntary. Nobody's forced to participate there. And that might actually work, and you will have, on the other hand, you will have proprietarian individual societies, and they can coexist. So that is one thing. The other thing is, I think it will have enormous consequences on how we deal with each other on an individual level. Because in cryptoanarchy, a lot of things you cannot delegate to a state, and you don't have to delegate them to the state. Which means that interactions between people become much more personal. Even if they might be remote, it's only two people dealing with each other. And even if it's anonymous, it kind of sounds contradictory, but it's not faceless. Because you're actually just dealing with the agreements that you have with each other. No third party. No gray goo that is called government or corporation or whatever.
No calling the police on your neighbors when the music is too loud.
No calling the police on the neighbors when the music is too loud. So you have to deal with humans on a human level again. And I think that is a positive thing.
So it's the more humanitarian system.
It's more humanitarian. The other thing is that also requires us to have changes in culture, in social protocols that we're using. a lot of these things, we don't know how they will look like. I mean, it's one of the things that we're here in TAZ0. One of the things we're actually experimenting with is how can we actually have protocols for crypto-anarchist future, social protocols. You mentioned it before with the issue of face masks, how do you actually still have a form of identity, and when you realize that identity is actually a good thing, in some circumstances, how to recreate that, how to make that work in the face of, on the other hand, surveillance. A lot of these things have to be experimented, developed, etc. So there's a lot of non-computer work that has to be done. A lot of social and cultural developments are necessary. And
I think it's a mistake to think that we should know these things beforehand. I mean, these are really things we have to experiment with,
yes,
and find them out. And
yes,
like you said, they can be very different in different communities.
Yes.
And which is also something which increases human freedom, because
exactly,
people want to live differently and they should have the ability to do that.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it unleashes creativity. It unleashes not just engineering creativity, but I'm really thrilled, for example, with the first artists dealing with the topic of cryptoanarchy. I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating to have people with a completely different view, more aesthetic view, to look at these things, and come up with not necessarily solutions, but inspirations.
I mean, I think we already see the beginnings of that, like crypto art and
yes,
stuff like, digital artworks on the blockchain. You know? But these are really just the beginnings. I think it's more like that the artists kind of take in the inspirations from technology, but soon they will actually have an impact on technology, or play with it themselves. With what you said, it's like it really brings in a totally different perspective.
Yes, and it's not just visual art. So, for example, one of the things that I really like is when writers, creative writers, deal with these things. A lot of stuff that is in the realm of cryptoanarchy has actually been years ago touched by creative writing. There are novels, science fiction, etc. But I actually think that there is a lot of potential for writers to continue that reimagining. What's the name of this Neil Stephenson book, the latest one? Help me there.
I don't know off the top of my head right now.
Okay, so we're two of that. Dodge, I think is the name. Dodge or Go to Hell or something like that. So, and there's a crypto-anarchist topic in there. So the book contains a technology that is actually about people being able to, to anonymously enroll in college without, or write papers or stuff like that. So they can have a digital online identity that they can control and that they can work through in academia, etc. And that on the one hand protects their privacy, on the other hand allows them to have a career. And that, for example, would be a really good idea if you're concerned about, for example, racism, or sexism. The ability to begin interaction in a career without bringing certain properties with you is a really interesting aspect to explore. So you have that with Stevenson, and I think that there are a lot of. I hope that there will be a lot of writers that explore the ideas of what anonymity, non-observability, non-attribution can actually mean for society in both positive and negative, and come up with stories that can also inspire then the engineers and the other artists, or everybody actually, to build a new future.
I totally agree, and I think this is hugely important. Like for me, the Paul Rosenberg's book, Lodging of Wayfaring Man, was really a keystone of my quote development as a crypto-anarchist.
Yeah.
Just because it kind of brought this vision to life.
Yeah.
We need more of that. More.
Yes.
Novels, even movies, where people bring the vision to life, and you can think like, oh, okay, this would be one possible world or one community and another one. And because that actually drives people a lot more than a theoretical text. I mean, we are like a species of stories. And it's really important that we also create these visionary stories. And
I completely agree.
Yeah.
That actually, I think that is really important what you said concerning creating vision, because I think that one of the things that is really bad about our current day is that people don't have positive vision anymore.
It's always about fighting something.
Yeah, right? It's always about fighting something, but it's not about creating a new idea, a new opportunity. It's all either taking what is already there and continuing it, or it's about taking down what is already there. But there's very little positive vision. There's very little where people can say, I can fight for something, not just against something, but for something.
Yeah.
And I think that there are aspects of cryptoanarchy that are positive outlooks. It's not just fighting against the surveillance state or whatever, but it's creating a new harmony between humanness and technology. I think that our basic mistake in the last, 150 years has been that we have taken an inhuman system of control and added technology to it. And I think that we should take technology and humanness and create a human technological future. And on that path, I think that cryptoanarchy is at least one of the good options there.
Yeah.
And I think that developing that vision and implementing it, experimenting with it, small scale, local communities, etc., can actually empower us as a whole, not just, as crypto-anarchists, but we might have some ideas and some solutions that are good for everybody on this planet, and there is such an open space, such a space of thought and experimentation and innovation, there's so much you could do, and so much impact you could have. It's an open frontier to go to and to challenge the future, and say, okay, I'm going to be part of that future, and I'm going to create something. I'm creating something new, something that hasn't been there before, something positive, and that is completely doable in cryptoanarchy.
Yeah, a positive alternative future with technology.
Yes.
I think a lot of the alternative visions for the future, they are often against technology.
Yes.
And that's also because they can't really compete. When you're facing a technological system of control, you kind of have to compete with it with technology. Otherwise, you're just gonna lose. I mean, there's no place to hide anymore. I mean, you can't go to the woods and hide. it's over. And so we really need this positive vision. And also, like we said, discussed, have the artists, the writers creating that vision. You know, I would really love to have some, like we have cyberpunk as a genre, to have, cypherpunk as a genre.
Yes.
Where you have these stories of alternative crypto-anarchist communities and technologies and how the implications they will have and stuff like that. Because that really, that will then also inspire another generation of engineers building these solutions.
Yes.
I mean, you can see that a lot today as well with billionaires trying to go to Mars.
Yes.
Stuff like that. They've been inspired by stories and also by previous technologies to do that.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of what is happening right now is that we're just taking the concepts of mainstream technology and industry and whatever, and then people slash some crypto on top.
Blockchainify.
Yeah, blockchainify mainstream technology.
Yeah.
And that is bland. It's a nothingness. When Bitcoin actually came out, I was inspired. I went around, and gave talks about Bitcoin.
I remember, yeah.
And
I did the same.
Exactly, you did the same, and because it was an open space, and because there was opportunity.
Yeah.
And today, when I look at the blockchain field, I see startups, and I see UI, and I see whatever, but it's all copies of what is already there.
Yeah.
It's in a way everybody's trying to be mainstream, but not
they take some shitty technology and put it on the blockchain.
Or that.
Yeah, it's something that is already there, but just
exactly. But there's no vision.
There's
no alternative vision. It doesn't look different from the shit that you get from Apple. It doesn't work different from the shit that you get from Google. It doesn't transport new values. The only thing that I at least often see is that it's against the Fed.
And it's decentralized.
Which is a relatively meaningless term,
But it seems to be the most important value.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, but it's contentless. I really wish that as a whole we can create a lot of new visions and dreams of a future that is worth living for everybody.
Yeah. I hope so too. Yeah, I think it's we covered a lot in this first episode. Do you have anything more to add on to the question, what is Cryptoanarchy? What is it for?
Well, I think that we will probably touch on this subject again in the future. If anybody has a question about it, commentary, whatever, please send us an email to bitstream at taz0.org, taz0.org. We're really happy about any feedback. Tell us where we screwed up. Tell us what we didn't think about. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what we should talk about in the future. Any questions? If you want to support us, there's an address where you can drop some coin for us. And it was a joy to record this first episode.
Yeah, it was really fun. You can find our donation address and also the PGP key for our email address when you want to, start practicing being a crypto anarchist. You can find it at taz0.org/bitstream. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting some feedback and comments, and hope to have this conversation again, have another conversation with Smuggler and hang
Frank
around
Brown.
in the container. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.